Ryan slammed the divorce papers onto the kitchen table so hard that the coffee mug beside them rattled and nearly fell. Emily was still on her knees with a wrench in her hand, trying to fix the heater that had been broken for 3 days because they could not afford a repairman. She looked up at her husband, dressed in a suit that cost more than their monthly rent, and heard him say the words that would end everything they built together. "You were never meant to rise with me. You were just someone who helped me get here." Before we continue, if you're watching this and you believe no one deserves to be thrown away after everything they've given, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end, because what happens to this woman next will make you believe in justice again. And in the comments section, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter used to believe that love meant patience. She used to believe that if you gave enough of yourself to someone, eventually they would see you, truly see you, and love you back with the same devotion. She had believed that for 8 years. She was about to learn, in the cruelest way possible, that belief and truth are not always the same thing. She was 32 years old, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her look older some mornings, especially the mornings after a double shift at the diner, followed by 4 hours of bookkeeping work she did from her laptop at the kitchen table, squinting under a single lamp because the overhead light had burned out months ago and they never got around to replacing the bulb. She used to dream of being an architect. She used to fill sketchbooks with building designs, curved staircases, glass atriums that let sunlight pour into empty rooms. Somewhere between her wedding day and this cold winter evening in Seattle, those sketchbooks had disappeared into a box in the garage, buried under things neither of them touched anymore. Ryan Mitchell had been different once. She reminded herself of that constantly, the way people cling to old photographs long after the people in them have changed into strangers. When they met, Ryan was an ambitious young man with nothing but a business degree and a dream of working in real estate investment. He used to talk to her for hours about the kind of life they would build together. He used to hold her hand across cheap diner tables and tell her that she was the only person who ever believed in him before he had anything to show for himself. "You're the reason I keep going," he told her once, years ago, in a tiny apartment with a mattress on the floor and a window unit that barely cooled the room in summer. "When this company finally sees what I'm capable of, it's going to be because of you. I mean that, Emily." She held on to that sentence for 8 years. She held on to it the way a drowning person holds on to driftwood, not realizing the driftwood was rotting the entire time. Because somewhere along the way, something inside Ryan shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, in small cruelties that Emily kept excusing, kept explaining away, kept telling herself were just stress, just pressure, just a man trying to provide. It started with him working later and later, then coming home smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't the brand he used to wear. It started with him correcting the way she dressed when they went to his company dinners, telling her the blouse she loved looked a little tired, suggesting she borrow something nicer from a coworker's wife instead. It started with him actually flinching, when she mentioned her old dream of architecture at a dinner party, as if her ambition embarrassed him in front of people who had never worked a double shift in their lives. "Emily, please, not tonight," he had whispered to her once, gripping her wrist under the table when she brought up wanting to take night classes again. "These people don't need to hear about that." Those people. That was what he called them. Those people. As if she needed permission to want something for herself. As if her dreams were an inconvenience to be managed rather than celebrated. She swallowed it. She always swallowed it. Because underneath the swallowing was a terrifying fear that if she pushed too hard, if she asked for too much, she would lose him. And losing him felt, at the time, like losing everything she had sacrificed for. And she had sacrificed so much. She worked 3 jobs during the years Ryan was building his career at Mitchell Global Development's predecessor company. She waited tables in the mornings. She did freelance bookkeeping in the afternoons. Some nights she cleaned offices downtown just to bring in a little extra so they could make rent, while Ryan worked unpaid overtime trying to prove himself to executives who barely knew his name. She remembered one particular night, years into their marriage, when Ryan came home furious after being passed over for a promotion. He threw his keys across the room. He didn't say a single word to her, not a hello, not an acknowledgement that she had stayed up past midnight with dinner still warm on the stove. "Ryan," she said softly, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Talk to me. What happened?" "What happened?" he repeated, his voice sharp and bitter. "Is that some kid 5 years younger than me with a fancier last name got the position I've been working toward for 2 years. That's what happened." "I'm so sorry," Emily said, walking toward him, reaching for his shoulder. He shrugged her hand off. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, Emily. Sorry doesn't get me anywhere." She stood there for a long moment, stunned, feeling something crack quietly inside her chest, though she didn't yet have the words for what that crack meant. She simply nodded, turned back to the kitchen, and reheated his dinner without another word, because that was what she always did. She absorbed his anger so he wouldn't have to sit with it alone. That was the pattern of their marriage. Ryan's failures became storms that Emily weathered silently, and Ryan's successes, when they finally started coming, somehow became reasons to distance himself from her rather than draw closer. Because the promotions did eventually come. 2 years before the divorce, Ryan was hired into a senior position at Mitchell Global Development, a real estate investment firm with offices across 3 states. And with that position came something Emily hadn't anticipated. It came with a circle of people who had never known hunger, who had never counted coins for gas money, who looked at Emily's second-hand coat and her tired hands and quietly, cruelly, decided she did not belong. Ryan began attending galas without her, claiming they were just work things, claiming she wouldn't enjoy them anyway. Emily told herself this was fine. She told herself she didn't need those rooms full of people discussing yacht clubs and ski trips in Aspen. But late at night, scrolling through photos Ryan occasionally posted from these events, she felt something she had never let herself name before. She felt erased. There was one night, only 4 months before everything ended, when Emily finally asked him directly, "Do you not want people to know I'm your wife?" she asked, standing in their bedroom while Ryan buttoned a shirt she had never seen before. A shirt that must have cost more than a week of her diner wages. Ryan didn't turn around right away. When he finally did, his expression was something between guilt and irritation. "It's not that simple, Emily," he said. "Then explain it to me. Make it simple. These are important people. Investors, executives, people who could change the entire direction of my career. I need to present myself a certain way." "And I embarrass that presentation," Emily said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ryan hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer for him. "I didn't say that," he finally muttered, grabbing his jacket, refusing to meet her eyes as he walked out the door. Emily sat on the edge of their bed that night for nearly an hour, staring at nothing, feeling the walls of her own home tighten around her like a cage she had built with her own hands, one sacrifice at a time. She thought about calling her sister Grace, who lived 2 states away and had warned her years ago that Ryan's ambition would eventually swallow whatever softness he had left. But Emily didn't call. She never called. Because calling meant admitting that Grace had been right. And some stubborn, wounded part of Emily still wanted to believe that if she just held on a little longer, the man she fell in love with would come back to her. He never did. Instead, the financial pressure at home grew worse, not better, despite Ryan's rising position, because Emily later discovered, though she did not know it yet on this particular night, that Ryan had been quietly funneling money into an entirely different life. A life with new suits, expensive dinners with colleagues, gifts for people Emily had never met. Meanwhile, the heater in their home broke down in the coldest week of the year, and there was no money left to fix it, because Ryan told her the household budget was tight right now and asked her to figure something out, like she always did. So on that particular evening, the evening the papers landed on the table, Emily was kneeling on the cold kitchen floor in a sweater with a hole in the sleeve, trying to loosen a rusted valve with a wrench she had borrowed from a neighbor, while doing mental math in her head about how many more days they could survive on what remained in their checking account. $312. That was what was left until Ryan's next paycheck, which he had told her would be smaller than usual because of some temporary company restructuring. She didn't fully believe him anymore, not after months of small inconsistencies, but she didn't have the energy to fight about it either. She just needed the heater working before the temperature dropped further overnight. That was the state Ryan found her in when he walked through the front door. He wasn't wearing his usual work clothes. He was wearing an entirely new suit, tailored, dark navy, with a silk tie Emily had never seen. His shoes were polished to a shine that reflected the hallway light. He looked, Emily thought in that first instant, like a stranger standing in her doorway. "Ryan," she said, sitting back on her heels, wrench still in hand. "You're home early. Did something happen at work?" He didn't answer right away. He stood there for a long moment, looking at her, looking at the toolbox on the floor, the exposed pipe beneath the wall panel, the general disarray of a woman doing everything she could to keep their home from falling apart around them. Something in his expression made Emily's stomach tighten. "We need to talk," he said finally. Emily set the wrench down slowly. "Okay, let me just wash my hands." "Now, Emily." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch. She had heard Ryan frustrated before, tired before, even cold before. But this was different. This was decided. This was a man who had already made up his mind about something and was simply informing her of the verdict. She stood, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and followed him into the living room, her heart beginning to pound, though she couldn't yet name why. Ryan reached into a leather bag she had never seen before and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He set it on the coffee table between them with a deliberate, almost ceremonial motion, as if he had rehearsed this moment. "What is that?" Emily asked, though some deep animal part of her already knew. "Open it." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope. Inside were pages of legal documents, dense with language she needed a moment to parse, though the header at the top of the first page was unmistakable. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Emily's throat closed. She looked up at Ryan, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything other than what it appeared to be. "Ryan," she whispered, "what is this?" "It's what it looks like," he said, his voice frustratingly calm, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than the end of 8 years of marriage. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I want this handled quickly and quietly." "Handled," Emily repeated, the word tasting foreign and horrible in her mouth. "You want to handle our marriage. Don't make this dramatic." "Don't make this dramatic?" Her voice cracked. "Ryan, you just walked in here with divorce papers like you're serving me a business contract. Tell me what happened. Tell me what I did." Ryan exhaled sharply, the way he did when he thought someone was wasting his time. "You didn't do anything, Emily. That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" she demanded, standing now, the room tilting slightly around her. 8 years, Ryan. 8 years I worked 3 jobs so you could climb that ladder. 8 years I sat alone while you were at every dinner, every gala, every meeting. I gave up everything for you." And that was when Ryan said it, the words that would replay in Emily's mind for the rest of her life, the words that would become the wound she carried out of that house and into a future neither of them could yet imagine. "That's exactly the problem," Ryan said, his voice cold and final. "You gave up everything, Emily. You have nothing left to offer someone at the level I'm at now. You were never meant to rise with me. You were just someone who helped me get here." The silence that followed felt endless. Emily stood there, feeling something inside her chest, not just crack this time, but shatter completely. "Say that again," she whispered, though she had heard every word with perfect, devastating clarity. "Emily, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You think I'm beneath you now," she said slowly, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. "All those nights I worked myself to exhaustion, all those dinners I reheated alone, all those events you told me I wouldn't enjoy. This is what it was leading to. You climbing over me to get somewhere I'm no longer welcome." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. That silence, that refusal to defend himself was its own confession. "There's someone else, isn't there?" Emily said, though it wasn't really a question anymore. She had suspected it for months, buried the suspicion beneath excuses and hope. But standing here now, watching him refuse to meet her eyes, the truth arranged itself with brutal clarity. "That's not relevant," Ryan said. "Not relevant?" Emily's voice rose for the first time, years of swallowed anger finally breaking the surface. You're ending our marriage in our living room while I'm on the floor trying to fix a heater we can't afford to replace, and you're telling me the other woman isn't relevant? Her name is Victoria, Ryan said, as if that somehow made things better, as if giving the affair a name transformed it into something more acceptable. And she understands the world I'm trying to build. She fits into it. And I don't, Emily said quietly. Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Emily felt her legs go weak, and she sat down hard on the arm of the couch, the divorce papers still clutched in her trembling hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the house was the faint hum of the broken heater, still not fixed, still radiating the same cold that had settled permanently into Emily's chest. "I gave you everything," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm grateful for that," Ryan said, his tone shifting into something that almost sounded like he believed he was being generous. "But gratitude isn't the same as forever, Emily. People grow, people change. I've changed. You haven't kept up." "I haven't kept up," Emily repeated, disbelief and fury tangled together in her voice. "I worked 3 jobs so you could keep up, Ryan. I sacrificed my own dreams so you could chase yours, and now that you've caught them, you're throwing me away like I was never part of the plan." "You weren't," Ryan said, and the cruelty in his voice was almost casual, almost bored, as if he had rehearsed this cruelty in his head so many times it no longer cost him anything to say it aloud. "You were the plan for a different version of my life. I'm not that person anymore." Emily stood up so fast the papers scattered across the floor. "Get out," she said. "This is my house too, Emily." "Then I'll leave," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "But you will never, ever speak to me like that again." She turned and walked toward their bedroom, her mind spinning, her hands still trembling, 8 years of memories flooding through her all at once. The apartment with the mattress on the floor, the wedding they could barely afford, held in her aunt's backyard because a real venue was out of reach. The nights she stayed up helping him rehearse presentations for jobs he didn't get. The nights she held him after those failures, whispering that he was enough, that they would figure it out together. She pulled 2 old suitcases from the closet, the same suitcases they had used on their honeymoon, a 3-day trip to a lake cabin, because that was all they could afford at the time. She began packing without thinking, moving on pure instinct, her hands working faster than her mind could process what was happening. Ryan appeared in the doorway, his earlier coldness cracking slightly, replaced by something that almost resembled discomfort, though not quite guilt. "Emily, you don't have to do this tonight. We can talk about logistics tomorrow." "There's nothing left to talk about," Emily said, not looking at him, folding a sweater with hands that refused to stop shaking. "You made your decision. I'm making mine. Where will you even go?" Emily paused for just a moment, the question landing like a slap, because the truth was she didn't know. She had no savings of her own. Not really, since every dollar she earned over the years had gone toward keeping their household afloat while Ryan invested in his career, his wardrobe, his image. She had no family nearby. Her sister Grace was hours away. She had given up her friendship slowly over the years as Ryan's world expanded and hers contracted. But she would rather sleep on a park bench than spend one more night under this roof, breathing the same air as a man who had just told her she was never meant to rise with him. "That's not your concern anymore," she said, zipping the first suitcase closed. "Emily, be reasonable." She finally turned to look at him, and something in her expression must have surprised him because he took an involuntary step back. "Reasonable," she repeated. "You want me to be reasonable. Ryan, I have been reasonable for 8 years. I was reasonable when you missed my birthday for a work dinner. I was reasonable when you told me not to bring up architecture in front of your colleagues. I was reasonable when you started coming home smelling like someone else's perfume, and I told myself I was imagining things. I have spent 8 years being endlessly, patiently, foolishly reasonable. Tonight, I am done." She grabbed the second suitcase and walked past him, down the hallway, through the living room where the discarded envelopes still lay scattered across the floor, and out the front door into the biting cold of the Seattle evening. Ryan didn't follow her. He stood in the doorway, watching her walk down the driveway, dragging 2 suitcases behind her. And for one brief moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been regret, or perhaps just the recognition that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. But he said nothing. He simply closed the door. Emily didn't have a car of her own anymore, not since Ryan had insisted they sell her old sedan 2 years earlier to help cover a temporary cash flow issue that Emily now suspected had never truly existed. She walked 6 blocks in the cold, her suitcases growing heavier with every step, tears finally breaking free and freezing against her cheeks in the winter air, until she reached a small 24-hour coffee shop near the edge of downtown, its warm yellow light spilling out onto the sidewalk like the only kindness left in the world that night. She pushed open the door, the small bell above it chiming softly, and collapsed into a corner booth, setting her suitcases beside her like the only companions she had left. A young barista approached cautiously, noticing the tear stains on Emily's face, the disheveled state of her clothing, the suitcases that clearly did not belong to someone simply passing through for coffee. "Can I get you something?" the girl asked gently. "Just coffee," Emily whispered. "Whatever's cheapest." The barista hesitated, then said quietly, "Don't worry about it tonight. It's on me." Emily looked up at her, startled by the small, unexpected kindness, and felt fresh tears well in her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the sheer disorientation of receiving compassion from a stranger after being discarded by the man she had built her entire life around. "Thank you," Emily managed to say. She sat in that booth for hours, watching the city outside grow quieter as midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, then 2. She thought about calling Grace, but couldn't bring herself to dial the number, not yet, not while the wound was still this raw. She thought about her parents, both gone now for several years, and wondered what they would say if they could see her sitting in a coffee shop at 2 in the morning with everything she owned crammed into 2 suitcases. She thought about her grandfather, Alexander, a distant memory from her childhood, a quiet man who used to visit occasionally when she was young, who always looked at her with an odd intensity, as if he were studying her, memorizing her. Her family rarely spoke of him. He had grown estranged from most of them decades earlier, and Emily had always assumed it was simply old family drama, the kind every family carries and eventually stops explaining. She had no idea, sitting in that booth with her coffee growing cold, replaying Ryan's words over and over in her mind, that her grandfather's memory would soon become the single most important thing in her entire life. Around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally began to pull at her eyelids. The coffee shop had gone nearly silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the occasional passing car outside. Emily rested her head against the cool window glass, replaying the evening in fragments. Ryan's cold expression, the envelope on the coffee table, the word Victoria, spoken so casually as if it cost him nothing. "You were never meant to rise with me." She closed her eyes, and for a brief, merciful moment, exhaustion pulled her towards something close to sleep. That was when her phone rang. Emily jolted upright, her heart pounding, glancing at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, an area code she didn't recognize, definitely not local to Seattle. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, certain it was nothing more than a scam call or a wrong number at this ungodly hour. But something made her hesitate, her thumb hovering over the screen. Something about the timing felt strange, almost deliberate, as if the universe itself had been waiting for exactly this moment, the lowest point of her life, to reach out and answer. She swallowed hard, wiped the last of the tears from her cheeks, and answered the call. "Hello?" A calm, measured voice on the other end asked a question that would change absolutely everything. "Is this Emily Carter, granddaughter of Alexander Whitmore?" Emily's hand tightened around the phone. The question hung in the cold air of the coffee shop, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice, because no one had spoken her grandfather's name to her in almost 15 years, not since the small, awkward family gatherings of her childhood where the adults would go quiet whenever his name came up, as if speaking it too loudly might summon something they didn't want summoned. "Who is this?" Emily finally managed, her voice hoarse from crying, her heart suddenly pounding for a completely different reason than it had been an hour earlier. "My name is Jonathan Whitmore," the voice said, calm, measured, the voice of a man who had delivered difficult and life-altering news many times before and had learned exactly how to pace himself through it. "I'm an attorney. I handle estate matters for a private firm based in New York. I apologize for the hour, Ms. Carter, but this call cannot wait, and I've been trying to reach you for several days. I think you have the wrong person, Emily said, already reaching to pull the phone away from her ear. I don't know anyone named Whitmore. I haven't spoken to that side of my family in years. You're the daughter of Diane Carter, formerly Diane Whitmore, Jonathan said quickly, before she could hang up. You're the granddaughter of Alexander Whitmore, and I need you to listen to me for just 2 minutes, Ms. Carter, because after that, if you still believe I have the wrong person, I will never call you again. Emily froze, the suitcases beside her suddenly feeling very small and very real against her legs. She glanced around the coffee shop, at the barista wiping down the counter, at the 2 other customers hunched over their own laptops, and felt suddenly, absurdly exposed, as if the entire world could somehow hear this conversation. "How did you get this number?" she whispered. "It took considerable effort," Jonathan admitted. "Your grandfather kept meticulous records on his family, even the ones he never spoke to directly. I've spent the last 4 days trying to locate you after his passing." Something in Emily's chest twisted. "He's dead?" 3 weeks ago, Jonathan said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm very sorry for your loss, even if I understand that loss might feel complicated given the estrangement." Emily sat in silence for a long moment, staring at nothing, trying to summon some feeling for a man she barely remembered. A tall, quiet figure from a handful of childhood memories. A man who used to crouch down to her eye level and ask her strange, searching questions that no other adult ever asked a child. "What do you want to build, Emily? Not what do you want to be. What do you want to build?" She had been maybe 8 years old the last time she saw him. "I appreciate you telling me," Emily said carefully, "but I don't understand why this requires a phone call at 3 in the morning. Couldn't this have waited until a reasonable hour?" "Under normal circumstances, yes," Jonathan said. "But your grandfather's estate includes provisions that are time-sensitive, and frankly, Ms. Carter, my firm has been unable to reach you at any of your previous addresses. We discovered only yesterday that you may have recently relocated. I was afraid if I waited any longer, I would lose the ability to reach you at all." Emily's stomach turned cold. "How would you know I relocated?" There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough for Emily to feel a prickle of unease crawl up the back of her neck. "Miss Carter, I think it would be far better if we spoke in person. I understand this is unusual, and I understand you have every reason to be skeptical of a stranger calling you in the middle of the night, claiming to represent your late grandfather's estate. But I promise you, what I need to tell you is not something I can adequately explain over the phone." "I'm not going anywhere with a stranger," Emily said, her voice sharpening with the last remaining scraps of self-protection she had left after a night that had already stripped her of nearly everything else. "I don't know you. For all I know, this is some kind of scam." "A completely reasonable position," Jonathan said, and something about his calm, unbothered agreement made Emily pause. A scammer would have pushed harder. A scammer would have pressured her, rushed her, tried to extract information immediately. Jonathan did the opposite. "Here is what I propose, Ms. Carter. Tomorrow morning, I will have a car sent to wherever you are, along with a folder of documentation. Death certificate, estate filings, photographs of your grandfather from recent years, so you can verify for yourself that this is not a fabrication. You do not have to trust my voice on the phone. You only have to look at what I send you and decide from there whether you want to take the next step." Emily hesitated. Every rational part of her mind told her to hang up, to block the number, to chalk this up to some cruel coincidence on the worst night of her life. But there was something in the way Jonathan spoke, something patient and precise, that didn't match the frantic, greedy energy of the scam calls she'd received before about car warranties and lottery winnings. "Fine," she said finally. "Send whatever you're going to send, but I'm not agreeing to anything else." "That's all I'm asking," Jonathan said. "One more thing, Miss Carter, and I say this only because I would want someone to say it to me if our positions were reversed. Whatever has happened tonight, whatever brought you to wherever you are calling from at 3 in the morning, I hope you know that better things are coming. I don't say that lightly." The line went dead before Emily could ask what he meant. before she could ask how a stranger somehow seemed to know that her entire life had collapsed in on itself just hours earlier. She sat frozen in the booth, phone still clutched in her hand, staring out at the empty street, the neon glow of a closed pharmacy sign blinking across the road. Her mind raced between two impossible poles, the devastation of Ryan's betrayal on one side, and this strange, unexpected phone call on the other, and she felt, for the first time in years, something she hadn't felt in a very long time: curiosity. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in that booth until the sun began to rise, the barista eventually bringing her a second cup of coffee without being asked. And around 8 in the morning, exhausted, hollow, and unsure whether she had imagined the entire phone call, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number containing a single line. "Car will arrive at 9. Please be ready." Emily stared at the message for a long time before texting back the address of the coffee shop, because it was the only place she had left to give. At exactly 9 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up outside, and a driver in a simple gray suit stepped out and approached the door with an envelope in his gloved hands. "Ms. Carter?" he asked politely. Emily nodded, standing slowly, her legs stiff from the long, sleepless night. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to give you this personally," the driver said, handing her a thick envelope, "and to let you know that he's available to meet whenever you're ready, at your convenience, at his office downtown." Emily took the envelope with trembling hands and sat back down in her booth, tearing it open with an urgency that surprised her. Inside was exactly what Jonathan had promised: a death certificate bearing the name Alexander James Whitmore, dated 3 weeks earlier, a newspaper clipping, brief and understated, announcing the passing of a reclusive real estate investor at the age of 81, and photographs, several of them, of an elderly man in his final years, sitting on a porch somewhere with mountains in the background, his hair completely white now, but his eyes unmistakably the same eyes Emily remembered from her childhood: sharp, searching, patient. She held one photograph for a long time, feeling something unexpected rise in her chest. Grief, she realized. Grief for a man she barely knew, a man her family had erased from conversation for reasons no one ever fully explained to her. At the bottom of the envelope was a business card: Whitmore and Associates Private Estate Law. An address in downtown Seattle, closer than Emily expected. She looked at the card for a long time, then at her 2 suitcases beside her. Everything she owned in the world crammed into worn fabric and broken zippers, and made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of her life. She was going to that office. The building, when she arrived an hour later after walking the 12 blocks because she had no money for a cab, was nothing extravagant: a modest professional office on the 4th floor of an older downtown building, nothing that suggested the scale of what was about to unfold inside its walls. A receptionist greeted her warmly and led her immediately into a private conference room, where a man in his 60s stood to greet her, silver-haired, sharply dressed but not flashy, with kind, tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Ms. Carter," he said, extending his hand. "Jonathan Whitmore, thank you for coming." Emily shook his hand, still uncertain, still braced for some kind of catch. "I want to be honest with you," she said, sitting down in the chair he offered. "I've had the worst night of my life, and I don't have the energy to be scammed on top of everything else. So whatever this is, please just tell me directly." Jonathan nodded slowly, sitting across from her, folding his hands on the table. "That's fair. I'll be as direct as possible." He opened a leather folder in front of him and slid a single document across the table. "Your grandfather, Alexander Whitmore, spent the last 4 decades of his life building one of the largest privately held real estate portfolios in the country. He did this quietly, deliberately avoiding public attention, structuring his holdings through private trusts specifically to keep his name out of headlines and rankings. Very few people, even within the industry, knew the true scale of what he controlled." Emily looked at the document but didn't fully process the numbers yet, her mind still catching up. "He held luxury residential towers in New York City," Jonathan continued. significant commercial real estate across Los Angeles and San Francisco, retail and shopping districts throughout Texas, and thousands of acres of undeveloped and agricultural land in Colorado, some of which has appreciated enormously in the last decade due to expansion pressures from Denver. "Okay," Emily said slowly, still waiting for the part where this concerned her. Jonathan looked at her directly. "The total value of your grandfather's estate, as of the most recent appraisal completed last month, is approximately $1.3 billion. Emily let out a small, involuntary laugh, the kind of laugh that comes not from humor, but from a mind trying to process something too large to hold. "I'm sorry, what?" "1.3 billion, Jonathan repeated calmly. "And Ms. Carter, according to the final will, your grandfather filed 18 months before his death. You are the sole named beneficiary of his entire estate." The room seemed to tilt slightly around her. Emily gripped the edge of the table, her mind refusing, for several long seconds, to accept what she had just heard. "That's not possible," she finally said. "I haven't spoken to him in almost 15 years. My family barely mentions his name. There has to be some mistake. Surely there are other relatives, cousins, someone closer to him than me." "There are other relatives," Jonathan acknowledged. "Several, in fact, some of whom have already begun making inquiries since the will was filed publicly, which I should warn you about, because it's relevant to what happens next. But your grandfather was extraordinarily specific in his instructions. He didn't simply leave everything to a blood relative out of obligation, Miss Carter. He investigated, extensively, for years." "Investigated what?" "You," Jonathan said simply. "Your life, your character, how you carried yourself through difficulty. Your grandfather hired a private research team nearly 6 years ago, long before his health began declining, to study the lives of every potential heir in the extended family. He wanted to understand who they truly were, not who they presented themselves to be at holidays and family functions." Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He was watching me for 6 years?" "In a manner of speaking," Jonathan said gently. "Not surveillance in an invasive sense, nothing illegal, but thorough background research, financial records, professional history, interviews with people who knew you. He wanted to know how each candidate handled hardship, how they treated others when no one of consequence was watching, whether ambition had hollowed them out or whether they'd retained some sense of who they were underneath it." He slid another folder across the table, thinner this time. "Would you like to know what he found regarding you specifically?" Emily nodded, unable to speak. "Unable. He found a woman who worked 3 jobs to support her husband's career without ever asking for recognition. He found a woman who, according to former co-workers, regularly gave up her own breaks to cover for single mothers on her shifts who needed to leave early for their children. He found a woman who 5 years ago, when her elderly neighbor could no longer afford her medication, quietly paid the difference for over a year without ever mentioning it to anyone, including, as far as we can tell, your own husband." Emily's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. She had genuinely forgotten about Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly widow 2 doors down from their old apartment, forgotten how many months she had skipped her own lunch to cover that gap. "He found," Jonathan continued, his voice softening even further, "a woman who sacrificed a promising future in architecture, walking away from a partial scholarship at a design program in her early 20s in order to help support a young marriage that was struggling financially. Your grandfather noted in his private files that this was the moment that convinced him you understood something most of the other heirs never would." "Understood what?" Emily whispered. "That real value isn't about what you accumulate for yourself," Jonathan said. "It's about what you're willing to give up for people you love without needing anyone to witness it." Emily pressed a hand over her mouth, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, an overwhelming, disorienting mixture of grief for a grandfather she barely knew and had somehow known her more deeply than her own husband ever had, and a fresh, sharp pain as Ryan's words from the night before echoed cruelly through her mind. "You were never meant to rise with me. You were just someone who helped me get here." "He saw exactly what I gave up," Emily said quietly, mostly to herself, "and the person I gave it up for couldn't see it at all." Jonathan watched her carefully, giving her a moment before continuing. "Miss Carter, I have to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before answering, because your response will significantly shape how we proceed from here. Are you currently, legally, still married? Emily's breath caught. Yes, as of last night, Ryan filed for divorce. It's not finalized, not even close. Something shifted subtly in Jonathan's expression, a flicker of concern quickly masked by professional composure. I see. And can I ask, does your husband have any knowledge of your grandfather or of this inheritance? None, Emily said. He barely knows anything about my extended family. I never talk about them. There was nothing to talk about as far as I knew. Jonathan nodded slowly, seeming to relax slightly. That's fortunate, actually, though I understand the timing must feel almost unbearably strange to you. Under the laws of the state and pending how quickly your divorce proceedings move, there are protective structures we can put in place to ensure this inheritance remains entirely separate from any marital assets, provided we act swiftly and discreetly. I don't understand, Emily said, wiping her eyes. You're saying Ryan could try to claim part of this? If the estate transfer happens while you are still legally married and the divorce isn't finalized, depending on how aggressive opposing counsel becomes, it's not impossible that a claim could be made, Jonathan said carefully. Inheritances are typically considered separate property, but marital timing complicates things, especially with an estate this size. I would strongly advise moving forward with structuring the inheritance into an irrevocable trust immediately, naming you as sole beneficiary and controller before any further steps are taken in the divorce. Emily sat back in her chair, her mind spinning through implications she was still too exhausted and too raw to fully process. 12 hours ago, she had been on her knees on a kitchen floor, calculating whether $300 would last until Friday. Now she was being told she needed to protect a $1 billion inheritance from the same man who had just called her worthless. Do it, she said suddenly, her voice steadier than she expected. Whatever protects it, whatever keeps it separate, do it immediately. Jonathan smiled slightly, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him. I was hoping you'd say that. Over the following days, Emily's life transformed in ways that felt almost unreal, disconnected from the woman who had slept in a coffee shop booth just 72 hours earlier. Jonathan arranged temporary housing for her, a modest but comfortable apartment near his office, explaining that it would remain in the trust's name, completely separate from anything Ryan could ever touch. He connected her with a team of financial advisors, estate managers, and eventually, at Emily's insistence, a therapist, because Jonathan gently pointed out that inheriting an empire while simultaneously grieving the collapse of an 8-year marriage was not something anyone should navigate entirely alone. You've been running on adrenaline, Jonathan told her during their third meeting, watching her hands shake slightly as she signed yet another document. That won't last forever. Please take care of yourself through this, Ms. Carter. The money will still be there next week. Your well-being might not be, if you don't slow down. Emily appreciated him more with every meeting. This quiet, careful man who seemed genuinely invested in her well-being, rather than simply the transaction of transferring an inheritance. But even amid the disorientation, one question kept surfacing in Emily's mind, sharp and insistent. Should she tell Ryan? She raised it with Jonathan during their fourth meeting, sitting in his office with a cup of tea she barely touched. I keep going back and forth, she admitted. Part of me wants to call him right now and tell him exactly what he threw away. Part of me never wants him to know any of this exists. Jonathan considered this for a long moment. May I offer a perspective, purely as someone who has seen many inheritance situations unfold, particularly ones involving significant wealth and recent separations? Emily nodded. People change, Ms. Carter, when large amounts of money enter a relationship, even relationships that have already ended. If your husband learns about this inheritance while your divorce is still unresolved, I have seen more times than I'd like to admit, individuals suddenly develop a renewed and remarkably urgent interest in reconciliation. Emily's jaw tightened. You think he'd come back? I think, Jonathan said carefully, that a man who called you worthless 12 hours before learning you controlled over $1 billion might discover, rather conveniently, that he'd made a terrible mistake. The thought made Emily's stomach turn with a nausea that had nothing to do with exhaustion. So what do I do? For now, Jonathan said, nothing. Let the divorce proceed on its current terms. Let him believe the version of events he currently believes. In the meantime, we finish structuring the trust, we finalize your protections, and you take some time, real time, to decide how and when, or even if, you want him to know the truth. There's no rush, Ms. Carter. The estate isn't going anywhere. But your peace of mind matters, and rushing this decision while you're still this raw could cost you more than you realize. Emily agreed, though something in her, some small, wounded, furious part of herself, wanted desperately to imagine the look on Ryan's face if he ever found out what he had walked away from. She didn't have to imagine it for long. 3 weeks into the estate transfer process, during a routine portfolio review meeting with the property management division of her grandfather's holding company, an executive named Patricia Vance slid a tenant occupancy report across the table toward Emily, part of a routine overview of commercial properties within the Colorado and Pacific Northwest portfolio. "This is just for your awareness," Patricia explained, "but I wanted to flag it since we're finalizing your ownership structure this week. One of our commercial towers here in Seattle currently has a fairly significant corporate tenant occupying 3 full floors, on a lease that's coming up for renewal negotiation in the next quarter." Emily glanced at the document without much interest at first, still adjusting to the sheer volume of properties now technically under her control, dozens of buildings across multiple states, more than she could realistically remember by name. Then her eyes landed on the tenant name printed clearly at the top of the occupancy report. Mitchell Global Development. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She read the name again, certain she had misread it. Certain her exhausted, overwhelmed mind was somehow conjuring connections that didn't exist. "Is something wrong?" Patricia asked, noticing the sudden change in Emily's expression. "That company," Emily said slowly, her voice barely steady. "Mitchell Global Development, can you tell me more about their lease?" Patricia pulled up additional details on her tablet. "Certainly. They've occupied the space for just over 2 years. One of our stronger commercial tenants, actually. Consistent payment history. And interestingly, they're currently in the middle of preparing a major expansion proposal, something involving a significant capital investment deal they're hoping to close within the next 2 months. Their senior leadership has requested additional floor space to accommodate the growth if the deal goes through." Emily sat perfectly still, feeling the room narrow around her, feeling the entire impossible coincidence settle over her like a wave. Ryan's company, Ryan's office, the building where he had likely walked past her name 100 times on ownership documents without ever knowing it, the building where, if the timeline matched what she suspected, he might currently be preparing the very presentation that could define the next chapter of the career he had chosen over her. "Ms. Carter?" Patricia asked, concern creeping into her voice. "You've gone pale. Is everything all right?" Emily swallowed hard, forcing her voice into something resembling composure. "I know that company," she said quietly. "I know it very well." She didn't explain further, and Patricia, sensing something deeply personal beneath the reaction, wisely didn't push. That night, alone in her new apartment, Emily sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a printed copy of the occupancy report Patricia had given her, Ryan's company name staring back at her in stark black text, and felt an entire storm of conflicting emotions crash through her chest at once. Fury first, sharp and immediate, at the sheer cosmic unfairness of it, that the empire she now controlled included the very walls sheltering the ambition Ryan had chosen over her. But beneath the fury, something else began to stir, something quieter, colder, more deliberate, because Emily suddenly understood with startling clarity that she held a kind of power over Ryan's future that he could never possibly imagine, a power that had nothing to do with revenge in the petty, small sense, but everything to do with the simple, devastating fact that the man who told her she had nothing left to offer was, at this very moment, dependent on decisions that now rested, quite literally, in her hands. She thought about calling Jonathan immediately, but stopped herself, staring instead at her own reflection faintly visible in the dark kitchen window, remembering the woman she had been just weeks earlier, kneeling on a cold floor with a wrench in her hand, being told she was worthless by the same man whose entire career now occupied a building she owned. She thought of something her grandfather apparently once wrote, a line Jonathan had shared with her from Alexander's private journals during their third meeting, a line that Emily hadn't fully understood at the time, but suddenly felt with devastating clarity now. The people who underestimate you are only revealing what they were never capable of seeing in the first place. Emily picked up her phone, not to call Ryan, not yet, but to call Jonathan. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep, despite the relatively early hour. "Miss Carter, is everything all right?" "I need to know everything about Mitchell Global Development's expansion deal," Emily said, her voice steady now, stripped of the tears and disorientation of weeks earlier, replaced by something new, something that felt almost unfamiliar to her. "Their timeline, their lease terms, their financial standing, all of it. Can you get me that information?" There was a brief pause on the line, and when Jonathan spoke again, Emily could hear something shift in his tone, something like understanding, and perhaps a flicker of quiet approval. "May I ask what's changed?" Emily looked down at the occupancy report, still spread across her table, at Ryan's company name, printed in stark, undeniable black ink. "I just found out," she said slowly, "that the man who told me I had nothing left to offer is currently standing inside a building that belongs to me, preparing to beg investors for the future he thinks he built entirely on his own." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll have the full file on your desk by morning," Jonathan said quietly. "Thank you," Emily said, and for the first time in weeks, something that almost resembled a smile crossed her face, though it carried none of the warmth her smiles used to hold. This one was sharper, colder, something entirely new. She hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her apartment for a long time, the city lights of Seattle glowing faintly through the window, and thought about Ryan somewhere across that same skyline, likely asleep beside a woman named Victoria, likely believing the wife he had discarded was still exactly where he left her, broken, powerless, disappearing quietly into whatever life she could scrape together on her own. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that within a matter of weeks, the empty coffee shop booth where Emily Carter had spent the worst night of her life would become nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by boardrooms, legal teams, and a quiet, calculated patience that would eventually bring Ryan Mitchell face to face with the exact moment he would understand, too late, precisely what he had thrown away. For now, though, Emily closed her laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and allowed herself, for the first time since that terrible night, something dangerously close to peace. Because somewhere deep inside her, beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the lingering ache of Ryan's cruelty, a new version of Emily Carter was beginning to take shape, one who understood exactly what she was worth, and one who was about to make absolutely certain that Ryan understood it too. Jonathan kept his word. By 7 the next morning, a courier arrived at Emily's apartment with a sealed folder containing everything he had promised, and Emily spent the entire day at her kitchen table reading through it line by line, a cup of coffee going cold beside her, her mind sharpening with every page in a way it hadn't sharpened in years. Mitchell Global Development was not the thriving powerhouse Ryan had always presented it as during their marriage. Beneath the polished exterior, the surface-level success he loved to display at galas and dinner parties, the company was carrying more debt than Emily expected, stretched thin by an aggressive expansion strategy that depended almost entirely on securing a massive new investment round within the next 60 days. If the deal fell through, several senior executives, according to internal memos Jonathan's research team had somehow obtained through entirely legal channels, were prepared to walk away and take their own client relationships with them. And at the center of that expansion proposal, the presentation meant to convince a room full of investors that Mitchell Global Development deserved hundreds of millions of dollars in new capital, was Ryan. His name appeared throughout the documents as lead strategist for the deal, the executive whose reputation and credibility were most directly tied to its success or failure. A promotion, a partnership stake in the firm, an entirely new tier of wealth and status, all of it hinged on convincing investors that his company's growth trajectory justified the risk. Emily read through the lease agreement for the building 3 separate times, understanding now with complete clarity what Jonathan had been trying to explain to her days earlier. The lease Mitchell Global Development currently held was set to expire in 4 months. Buried within the renewal clause was language giving the property owner, meaning Emily, significant discretion over renewal terms, including the ability to decline renewal altogether with 90 days' notice, or to renegotiate terms that could dramatically affect the company's operating costs at the exact moment investors would be scrutinizing every line of their financials. She sat back in her chair, staring at the document, feeling something settle over her that she hadn't expected to feel this soon. Not fury, exactly. Something colder, something more patient. She thought about calling Jonathan immediately to discuss options, but stopped herself, because a question kept surfacing beneath the anger, insistent and uncomfortable. Did she actually want to destroy Ryan's career? Or did she want something else entirely, something she hadn't yet let herself name? She sat with that question for 3 full days before she had her answer. And when it came, it arrived not through fury, but through memory. She remembered standing in their bedroom 4 months before the divorce, asking him directly whether he was ashamed of her, and watching him refuse to meet her eyes. She remembered every gala she wasn't invited to, every dinner she wasn't mentioned at, every slow, deliberate erasure of her presence from his life, long before the divorce papers ever appeared. She remembered kneeling on that kitchen floor with a wrench in her hand while he stood in the doorway in a brand new suit. And she remembered, with a clarity that made her hands tremble, exactly what he had said. "You were never meant to rise with me. You were just someone who helped me get here." She didn't want to destroy him out of petty spite. She wanted him to understand, completely and undeniably, exactly what he had thrown away. She wanted him to stand in a room and realize that the woman he discarded as worthless was the same woman holding his entire future in her hands. And she wanted to watch that realization break something open inside him, the way his words had broken something open inside her. She called Jonathan that evening. "I'm not going to interfere with the lease," she told him, her voice calm and deliberate. "Not yet. I want to see how this plays out first. I want to understand exactly what kind of man Ryan has become before I decide what to do with the power I have over his future." "That's a wise approach," Jonathan said. "May I ask what changed your thinking?" "I don't want revenge born out of anger," Emily said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "I want the truth to surface on its own. If Ryan is the man I'm starting to suspect he's become, he'll show it himself, without me having to force anything. And if he doesn't show it? If he genuinely believes he did nothing wrong?" Emily was quiet for a long moment. "Then I'll know exactly what to do." Over the following weeks, Emily immersed herself in learning her grandfather's world, spending long hours with Jonathan and the executive team reviewing properties, understanding financial structures, absorbing decades of business knowledge in a compressed, intense education that left her exhausted every night, but strangely, unexpectedly, alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She began working with an architecture consultant, revisiting the dreams she had buried nearly a decade earlier, reviewing blueprints for a renovation project on one of her grandfather's older commercial buildings downtown. And something in her chest loosened every time she sat over those drawings, tracing lines and imagining spaces, remembering exactly why she had fallen in love with design in the first place before life had convinced her to set it aside. "You have a natural eye for this," the consultant, a woman named Priya, told her during one session, looking over Emily's suggested modifications to a lobby redesign. "Have you had formal training?" "A long time ago," Emily said. "I gave it up." "Well," Priya said, studying the sketch again, "I'd say it's time you picked it back up." Emily smiled at that, a real smile this time, the first one in longer than she could remember. Meanwhile, according to updates Jonathan occasionally passed along from routine building management reports, Ryan's world continued exactly as it had before, unaware that anything had shifted beneath his feet. He was seen frequently in the building lobby, Patricia mentioned during one update, always dressed sharply, always moving with the confident energy of a man who believed his ascent was inevitable. He had been photographed at 2 more industry galas, always with the same woman at his side, A striking blonde woman named Victoria Lane, whose face Emily eventually recognized from a marketing firm's website when curiosity finally got the better of her one night. Victoria was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of woman Ryan had always seemed to want beside him. Polished, connected, comfortable in rooms full of money in a way Emily had never quite managed to be, no matter how hard she tried during their marriage. Emily studied Victoria's photo for a long time that night, waiting to feel the sharp sting of jealousy she expected, but instead feeling something closer to detached curiosity, almost pity, though she couldn't yet articulate why. She found out why 3 weeks later. Jonathan called her on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying a note of caution Emily had learned to recognize as meaning something significant. "I have some information you should know," he said. "It's not directly related to the lease or the business matters we've been discussing, but given everything, I felt you should hear it from me rather than stumble onto it another way." "What is it?" "Victoria Lane," Jonathan said. "The woman your husband has been seeing has a documented history that our research team uncovered during routine due diligence on Mitchell Global Development's key personnel and associates, since she's been informally advising on their marketing strategy for the expansion pitch." "Go on," Emily said, bracing herself. She was previously involved, romantically, with the founder of a competing real estate firm in Chicago, a relationship that ended 2 years ago when that founder's company collapsed following a major funding failure. Prior to the collapse, Victoria had reportedly been quite prominent at his side, similar to her current position beside your husband. Once the funding failed and his prospects diminished, she was, according to multiple sources, gone within a matter of weeks. Emily sat with that information for a long moment, absorbing its implications slowly. "You're telling me she's done this before," Emily said finally. Attached herself to a rising executive, then disappeared the moment his prospects failed. "I'm not in a position to speak to her character or motivations directly," Jonathan said carefully, always the lawyer, always precise. "I'm only sharing documented patterns that our research uncovered. What you do with that information is entirely your decision." Emily hung up the phone that night and sat in silence for a long time, feeling something complicated and uncomfortable settle over her. Because if what Jonathan's team had uncovered was accurate, Ryan had left her, the woman who sacrificed everything to support him through years of struggle, for a woman who, by all appearances, would leave him the moment his success wavered. She thought about warning him. The impulse surprised her, rising unbidden and uncomfortable, some old, stubborn remnant of the woman who used to reheat his dinner without complaint, who used to absorb his failures so he wouldn't have to carry them alone. But then she remembered his face in that living room, cold and certain, telling her she had nothing left to offer someone at his level. She remembered Victoria's name spoken so casually, as if the affair required no explanation, no accountability, nothing beyond simple acknowledgement. She said nothing. 4 weeks later, everything accelerated at once, the kind of sudden, cascading momentum that Emily would later look back on as the true turning point of everything that followed. The first call came from Patricia on a Thursday morning, her voice tight with something between excitement and concern. "Ms. Carter, I need to flag something for you immediately. Mitchell Global Development has requested an urgent meeting regarding their lease. Apparently their expansion deal, the one we discussed weeks ago, is moving faster than expected, and they need confirmation of additional floor space within the building to finalize their investor presentation. They're asking to meet with ownership directly, which is unusual, but given the timeline pressure, I wanted your guidance on how to proceed." Emily felt her pulse quicken. "When do they want this meeting?" "They're requesting this Friday, 2 days from now." Emily was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing through implications, possibilities, the sheer, staggering coincidence of timing that felt almost engineered by fate itself. "Do they know who owns the building?" Emily asked slowly. "The trust structure has kept individual ownership relatively private, as you requested," Patricia said. "Officially, they've been dealing with our property management division. I don't believe they're aware ownership recently transferred to you specifically. Most of our tenants simply see the holding company's name." Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an enormous decision pressing down on her. She could decline the meeting, keep herself entirely removed from the process, let her executive team handle it without ever revealing her involvement. That would be the safe choice, the choice that avoided confrontation entirely. or she could attend. "Schedule the meeting," Emily said finally, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. "But I want to attend personally." "Ms. Carter, are you certain? Given the history you mentioned, I want to make sure you're comfortable with—" "I'm certain," Emily said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "I need to see this through myself." That night, Emily called Jonathan, explaining the situation, and to her surprise, he didn't try to talk her out of it. "I think," he said carefully, "that you've earned the right to face this on your own terms, whatever that ends up looking like. But Ms. Carter, I want to prepare you honestly. This will likely be difficult, regardless of how it unfolds. Are you emotionally prepared for that?" Emily thought about the question seriously before answering. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know I need to do it anyway." "Then I'll be there with you," Jonathan said, "along with the appropriate members of the legal and executive team. You won't walk into that room alone." Friday arrived faster than Emily expected, and she spent the morning preparing with a focus and calm that surprised even herself, dressing in a sharp, elegant navy suit that Priya had actually helped her select during one of their design sessions, the kind of understated, powerful outfit that Emily would never have owned during her marriage, when every piece of clothing she wore had somehow needed Ryan's silent approval first. Looking at herself in the mirror before leaving, Emily barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because her face had changed, but because something behind her eyes had shifted entirely, something steady and certain that hadn't been there in years. The meeting was scheduled in a private conference room on the building's top floor, a room Emily had never visited, despite technically owning the entire structure. Jonathan met her in the lobby beforehand, along with 2 members of her executive team, and together they rode the elevator up in a silence that felt heavier with every passing floor. "Whatever happens in there," Jonathan said quietly as the numbers climbed, "you don't owe him an explanation. You don't owe him grace. You don't owe him anything at all. You're simply a property owner conducting business. Let that be your anchor if things become difficult." Emily nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The elevator doors opened, and Emily stepped out first, walking with a calm, measured pace toward the conference room at the end of the hall, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her executive team trailing slightly behind her. Through the glass walls of the conference room, she could see them already assembled inside, a handful of Mitchell Global Development executives seated around a long table, papers and laptops spread before them, the energy of the room tense with the particular anxiety of people about to negotiate something critically important. And there, at the head of the table, animated mid-conversation with a colleague, was Ryan. He looked exactly as Emily remembered, and also somehow completely different. Sharper somehow, more polished, though something in his posture carried a tightness Emily recognized instantly as stress, the same tightness he used to carry home during the years he was fighting for every promotion. Emily paused just outside the door, taking one steadying breath, feeling Jonathan's reassuring presence beside her. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Ready," Emily said, though her voice wavered slightly on the word. She pushed open the door. The conversation inside stopped almost immediately as the group turned toward the new arrivals, and Emily watched Ryan's eyes move across the group before landing on her, watched the exact moment recognition hit him, watched his face shift from polite professional attention to complete stunned disbelief. "Emily?" he said, his voice cracking slightly on her name, as if he genuinely couldn't process what he was seeing. The room went silent. Every executive at that table turned to look between Ryan and Emily, confusion evident on their faces, none of them yet understanding the significance of what was unfolding in front of them. "Hello, Ryan," Emily said, her voice calm, steady, carrying none of the tremor she felt inside. "What are you doing here?" Ryan asked, standing halfway out of his chair, his composure visibly cracking. "This is a private business meeting. How did you even get in here?" Before Emily could respond, Jonathan stepped forward smoothly, extending a professional hand toward the room. "Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Whitmore. I represent the ownership group of this building. This is Emily Carter, principal owner of the Whitmore Estate Holdings, which includes this property." The silence that followed was absolute. Emily watched the information land across the room in slow motion, watched confused glances shift into dawning, horrified realization among the executives seated at the table, and watched Ryan's face drain of color entirely as the words fully registered. "That's not possible," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper now. All his earlier authority evaporated completely. "Emily doesn't have any. She doesn't come from money. There's some mistake." "There's no mistake," Emily said, walking further into the room now, feeling strength settle into her spine with every step. "My grandfather, Alexander Whitmore, passed away several weeks ago. I inherited his estate. This building is part of that estate." One of the senior executives, an older man Emily didn't recognize, spoke up cautiously. "Ms. Carter, we had no idea. We've been dealing with the property management division for the entirety of our tenancy." "That was intentional," Emily said simply. "Until now." Ryan was staring at her like he was seeing a ghost, his mouth slightly open, his mind clearly racing to reconcile the woman he had discarded months earlier with the composed, powerful figure now standing at the head of the table that held his company's entire future in her hands. "Emily, can we speak privately?" Ryan said suddenly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We're here for a business meeting," Emily said calmly, "regarding your lease renewal and expansion request. I'd prefer to keep this professional, given the circumstances." "Please," Ryan said, and Emily could hear something genuinely desperate creeping into his voice now, a tone she had never once heard from him during their entire marriage, not even during his worst professional failures. "Just 5 minutes." Emily looked at Jonathan, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, silently communicating that the choice was entirely hers. 5 minutes, Emily said finally. "The rest of you, please remain here. We'll resume shortly." She followed Ryan into a small side office adjacent to the conference room, closing the door behind them, and the moment they were alone, Ryan's composure completely shattered. "Emily, I had no idea," he said, running his hands through his hair, pacing the small space frantically. "I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea any of this existed. Your grandfather, this inheritance, none of it. If I had known—" "If you had known what?" Emily interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended, though she didn't try to soften it. "If you had known I was going to inherit over $1 billion, you wouldn't have called me worthless? You wouldn't have told me I had nothing left to offer someone at your level?" Ryan flinched visibly. "That's not what I meant. I was under an enormous amount of pressure, Emily. Things were said in the heat of the moment that I regret." "You had divorce papers drawn up by a lawyer," Emily said. "That's not something said in the heat of the moment, Ryan. That's premeditated. You planned that conversation. You planned exactly what you were going to say to me." Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find a defense. "I've thought about this moment," Emily continued, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. "I imagined what I would say if I ever saw you again after that night. And do you know what surprises me the most, standing here right now?" "What?" Ryan whispered. "That I don't feel the satisfaction I expected to feel," Emily said. "I thought seeing you panic like this would feel good. Instead, I mostly just feel sad for the 8 years I spent believing you were building something with me, when really you were just using me as a stepping stone toward a life you always intended to leave me out of." "That's not true," Ryan said quickly, desperately. "Emily, we can fix this. Now that I understand what's happened, we can figure this out together. I never actually wanted the divorce, not really, I was just—" "Stop," Emily said, holding up a hand, cutting him off with a firmness that surprised even her. "Don't do that. Don't stand here and pretend this changes anything about what you actually believe. You didn't suddenly discover love for me in the last 90 seconds, Ryan. You discovered money. There's a difference, and I think you know it." Ryan's jaw tightened, the desperate mask slipping slightly to reveal something colder underneath, something calculating. "Emily, be reasonable," he said, his tone shifting now, becoming more businesslike, more strategic. "Think about what we could build together with resources like this. Think about the life we always talked about, the one we couldn't afford before. I know I made mistakes, but people deserve second chances." "You're not asking for a second chance with me," Emily said quietly, watching him with a clarity that felt almost painful. You're asking for a second chance with my money. And Ryan, I need you to hear me very clearly when I say this. Those two things will never, ever be the same thing again. She turned to leave, but Ryan grabbed her arm gently, stopping her. Wait, he said. The lease. The expansion deal. Emily, please, my entire career depends on this deal going through. If you pull this lease, if you refuse the expansion space, everything I've worked for is finished. Please, whatever you think of me personally, don't destroy my career over this. Emily looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face, seeing genuine fear there now, fear that had nothing to do with love or regret, and everything to do with self-preservation. Let go of my arm, she said quietly. Ryan released her immediately, stepping back. I'm not going to make a decision about your lease based on emotion, Emily said, straightening her jacket. I'm going to make it based on business logic, the same way I make every decision now. We'll finish this meeting like professionals, and you'll receive my decision through the appropriate channels like any other tenant. She walked back toward the door, then paused, turning back to face him one final time. You know what the strangest part of all this is, Ryan? My grandfather chose me for this inheritance specifically because he researched who I was as a person, how I treated people when nothing was at stake, how I handled hardship without losing myself. He never met you, but if he had, I wonder what he would have seen. She didn't wait for a response. She opened the door and walked back into the conference room where the assembled executives sat in tense, uncomfortable silence, watching her return with an authority that hadn't fully existed in her posture just 20 minutes earlier. Let's continue, Emily said calmly, taking a seat at the head of the table, Jonathan settling in beside her. I understand you're requesting additional floor space to support an expansion initiative. Walk me through your proposal. The meeting that followed was excruciating for everyone at that table except Emily, who found herself surprisingly composed as she listened to Ryan and his colleagues present their expansion case, asking sharp, informed questions about their financial projections, their growth timeline, their capacity to sustain increased overhead during the transition period. She wasn't asking these questions to sabotage him. She was asking because, for the first time in her adult life, she was genuinely engaged in understanding a business at this level, and something in her recognized with quiet satisfaction that she was good at it. By the end of the meeting, Emily hadn't given a final answer regarding the lease expansion. She told the room she would review their proposal formally and provide a decision within 2 weeks. Standard procedure, nothing that revealed any personal bias one way or another. As the meeting concluded and executives began filing out, Ryan lingered near the door, watching Emily gather her materials with Jonathan, his expression a complicated mixture of desperation, humiliation, and something that looked almost like grief. Emily, he said quietly, once most of the room had cleared. She looked up at him. For what it's worth, he said, I am sorry. Not because of any of this. He gestured vaguely around the room, indicating the building, the deal, the wealth now separating them. I'm sorry for how I treated you before any of this happened. I should have said that a long time ago, regardless of what you've become since. Emily studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity beneath the words, uncertain whether she believed him or whether this was simply another calculated attempt at damage control now that his career hung in the balance. Thank you for saying that, she said finally, her voice softer than before, though still carrying the steady composure she had built over the last several weeks. I hope you mean it. But Ryan, an apology doesn't undo 8 years, and it definitely doesn't buy back what you threw away that night. She walked out of the conference room without looking back, Jonathan falling into step beside her, and it wasn't until they were safely inside the elevator, doors closing, that Emily finally allowed her shoulders to drop, the enormous tension she had been carrying throughout the entire meeting, finally releasing in a long, shaking breath. You did remarkably well in there, Jonathan said quietly, watching her carefully. I feel like I'm going to be sick, Emily admitted, pressing a hand against the elevator wall to steady herself. That's an entirely normal reaction, Jonathan said gently. You just faced the man who devastated you months ago, in a room full of strangers, while holding his entire professional future in your hands. Whatever you're feeling right now, it's earned. Emily let out a shaky laugh, equal parts exhaustion and disbelief. He apologized. At the very end, I don't know if I believe him. "You don't have to know right now," Jonathan said. "You don't owe him certainty about how you feel. You're allowed to sit with complicated emotions for as long as you need to." The elevator doors opened, and Emily stepped out into the lobby, walking toward the exit with Jonathan beside her, her legs still slightly unsteady, but her mind clearer than it had been in months. But the story wasn't finished, not by any measure, because word of what happened in that conference room spread through Mitchell Global Development within hours, whispered between colleagues who had witnessed the stunned unraveling of their normally composed senior executive, and by the following morning, it had reached someone else entirely. Victoria Lane. Emily learned about it 2 days later, when Patricia called with an update on an entirely unrelated property matter, mentioning almost as an afterthought that Ryan had apparently had a very public, very heated argument with his girlfriend in the building lobby the previous evening, loud enough that several employees working late had witnessed it. "What was it about?" Emily asked, unable to suppress her curiosity despite herself. "I don't know the specifics," Patricia said, "but apparently Miss Lane discovered, rather abruptly, exactly who now owns the building her boyfriend's career depends on. And from what I heard secondhand, she was significantly less understanding about the situation than you might expect." Emily felt a strange, unexpected pang of something almost like vindication, though it was tangled with a deeper unease she couldn't quite name. Because if Victoria truly was the kind of woman Jonathan's research suggested, the kind who attached herself to rising success and disappeared the moment that success became uncertain, then Ryan's entire world, the one he had chosen over Emily, over 8 years of sacrifice and loyalty, was about to begin crumbling from every direction at once, and Emily hadn't lifted a single finger to make it happen. She simply existed now, in a position of power Ryan never could have imagined. And her mere existence, the simple truth of who she had become, was enough to set everything he built on top of her absence trembling at its foundation. 2 weeks later, exactly as promised, Emily's team delivered their formal decision regarding Mitchell Global Development's lease renewal and expansion request. But what the decision actually said, and what it would ultimately reveal about the true state of Ryan's company, the hidden financial irregularities Jonathan's research team would soon uncover, buried within Mitchell Global Development's books, was something Ryan Mitchell never saw coming. The formal decision letter went out on a Tuesday morning, delivered through proper legal channels exactly as Emily had promised, and what it contained was more measured than Ryan likely expected, though he wouldn't have called it merciful either. The lease renewal was approved. The expansion request, however, was denied, not out of spite. Jonathan had explained carefully during their final review, but because the numbers simply didn't support it. Mitchell Global Development's debt-to-income ratio, once properly analyzed by Emily's financial team, revealed a company far more fragile than its confident exterior suggested. "This isn't personal," Emily told Jonathan the morning the letter was finalized, reading over the language one last time before it went out. "This is what any responsible property owner would decide looking at these numbers." "I know that," Jonathan said. "The question is whether Ryan will understand it that way." He didn't. Word came back within 48 hours, not through Patricia this time, but through a call that came directly to Emily's phone, a number she hadn't saved but recognized instantly from the area code, the same one that used to flash across her screen for 8 years. She almost didn't answer. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment, phone buzzing in her hand before finally pressing accept. "You denied the expansion," Ryan said, no greeting, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "Emily, do you have any idea what that decision just did to me? The investors pulled back the moment they heard we couldn't secure additional space. The whole deal fell apart in less than a day." "I made a business decision based on your company's financials," Emily said calmly, though her heart was pounding. That's all this was. "Don't insult me," Ryan snapped. "You've been waiting for this. This is payback, dressed up as some kind of professional obligation." "If I wanted payback," Emily said, her voice sharpening now, "I wouldn't have approved the lease renewal at all. I could have ended your company's presence in that building entirely. I didn't. I made the decision the numbers supported." There was a long silence on the line, heavy with things neither of them said. "I need that expansion, Emily," Ryan said finally, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. "Please, reconsider, for the sake of everything we used to be to each other." "We used to be married," Emily said quietly. "That's not the same as owing you my business judgment." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking, and sat down hard at her kitchen table, staring at the phone as if it might ring again at any moment. It did 3 more times that evening. She didn't answer any of them. But Ryan, Emily would soon learn, was not a man who accepted defeat quietly, especially not defeat this public, this humiliating unfolding in front of colleagues who had witnessed his stunned unraveling in that conference room weeks earlier. Within days, whispers began circulating through Mitchell Global Development, whispers that eventually reached Emily through Patricia, about Ryan telling colleagues a very different version of events, one where Emily had deliberately, maliciously hidden her inheritance from him during their marriage, only revealing it once she had secured the divorce, timing everything specifically to destroy him professionally out of spite. "That's not what happened," Emily said flatly when Patricia relayed the rumor, sitting across from Jonathan in his office, her jaw tight with disbelief. "I didn't even know about the inheritance until after he filed for divorce. He filed first. He left me first." "I know that," Jonathan said calmly. But Ryan appears to be constructing a narrative, and narratives, unfortunately, often travel faster than facts, especially when someone tells them convincingly and repeatedly. Emily's unease deepened 2 weeks later, when the narrative escalated beyond private office gossip into something far more public and far more dangerous. She was sitting in her apartment on a quiet Sunday evening, working through architectural sketches for the downtown renovation project she had grown genuinely passionate about, when her phone buzzed with a text from Priya containing a single line and a link. "You need to see this." Emily clicked the link and her stomach dropped as an online business interview video loaded, a mid-sized industry podcast that covered real estate news and executive profiles, the kind of platform with a modest but influential audience among people in Ryan's professional circles. And there, sitting across from an interviewer in a sleek studio, was Ryan. Emily watched, her chest tightening with every passing second, as Ryan spoke with practiced, wounded sincerity about the collapse of his expansion deal, carefully framing himself as the victim of what he called a deeply personal betrayal disguised as a business decision. "My ex-wife inherited significant wealth during our separation," Ryan said, his voice carrying just the right note of restrained hurt for the camera. "And rather than being transparent with me about that inheritance during what should have been an amicable process, she concealed it, waited until she had legal ownership of a building critical to my company's growth, and then used that position to retaliate against me personally. I understand people go through difficult emotions during a divorce, but using billions of dollars to sabotage someone's career, someone you once claimed to love, that's something else entirely." Emily paused the video, her hands trembling with a fury so complete it left her momentarily breathless. "He's lying," she whispered to the empty apartment, though there was no one there to hear her defend herself. "He left me. He said I had nothing left to offer him. He's the one who—" She stopped herself, forcing a breath, forcing her mind to slow down enough to think clearly rather than simply react. She called Jonathan immediately, her voice shaking as she explained what she had just watched. "I saw it as well," Jonathan said, his tone grave. "Several colleagues forwarded it to me within the hour. Emily, I want you to understand something clearly before we discuss next steps. This interview is going to generate public sympathy for him in certain circles, and it's likely going to generate uncomfortable questions about you, questions you may find deeply unfair given everything you actually experienced. So what do we do?" Emily asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Do we respond? Do I need to do an interview of my own? Jonathan, none of what he said is true." "I know it isn't," Jonathan said calmly, "and I want you to trust me when I tell you this. We are not going to fight this battle in the court of public opinion, at least not yet. Ryan has made a critical mistake tonight, one I don't think he fully understands." "What mistake?" "He's invited scrutiny," Jonathan said. "Public figures who position themselves as victims in situations like this tend to attract exactly the kind of attention that eventually uncovers everything they were hoping to keep hidden. My research team has been conducting a routine financial audit of Mitchell Global Development as part of our lease evaluation process, standard practice for any tenant undergoing this level of financial distress. We were already finding irregularities before this interview aired. Now, given his public claims, I suspect we'll have justification to look far more closely. Emily sat with that for a long moment, torn between the satisfaction of knowing the truth might finally surface and the exhausting dread of watching this entire situation drag on, unresolved, indefinitely. "How long?" she finally asked. "Until we know something concrete." "Give it 2 weeks," Jonathan said. "I have people already working on it. In the meantime, Emily, please do not respond to this interview publicly. Do not engage with anyone asking you about it. Let him keep talking. The more he talks, the more rope he gives us to work with." Emily agreed, though the following days were among the hardest since the night she had left Ryan's house with 2 suitcases, because the interview, small as its original platform had been, began circulating further than either of them expected, picked up by a handful of larger business gossip accounts, generating comment sections full of strangers speculating about her character, her motives, her supposed cruelty toward a man they had never met and knew nothing about. She read some of those comments during a particularly weak moment late one night, immediately regretting it, seeing herself described as heartless, vindictive, a gold-digging opportunist who had married Ryan for his potential and then abandoned him the moment something better appeared. An interpretation so grotesquely inverted from the truth that Emily nearly laughed out loud despite the tears gathering in her eyes. She called Grace that night for the first time in months, finally breaking the silence she had maintained since the divorce began, needing to hear a voice that actually knew her. "Emily," Grace said, answering on the first ring, her voice immediately alert with concern. "I saw the interview. I've been wanting to call you, but didn't know if you needed space." "I needed you to call," Emily admitted, her voice cracking for the first time in weeks. "Grace, none of what he said is true. He left me. He called me worthless. He had an affair before he even filed the papers." "I know," Grace said firmly. "I know you, Emily. I've known you your entire life. Anyone who actually knows you sees exactly what he's doing right now, and it's disgusting." "But strangers don't know me," Emily whispered. "Strangers are reading his version and believing it." "Strangers don't matter," Grace said. "The people who matter know the truth. And Emily, listen to me. The people who matter are about to see the truth too, whether he wants them to or not." Grace's words stayed with Emily through the following 2 weeks, a small anchor of certainty amid the uncertainty. And true to Jonathan's prediction, those 2 weeks moved with a momentum that eventually eclipsed anything Ryan's interview had generated. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, Jonathan's voice carrying an intensity Emily hadn't heard from him before, urgent and serious in a way that made her sit down immediately. "Emily, I need you to come to the office, now if you can." "What's happening?" "We found something," Jonathan said. "Something significant. I'd rather explain it in person." Emily arrived at his office 40 minutes later, her heart pounding the entire drive, and found Jonathan waiting with 2 additional attorneys and a forensic accountant she hadn't met before, files spread across the conference table in careful, organized stacks. "Sit down," Jonathan said gently, and Emily did, her stomach twisting with anticipation. "What did you find?" she asked. The forensic accountant, a quiet, precise woman named Karen, slid a folder across the table. "Ms. Carter, over the past several weeks, our team conducted a thorough audit of Mitchell Global Development's financial records, initially as routine due diligence connected to their lease evaluation. What we discovered goes considerably beyond what we expected." "Explain," Emily said, her voice tight. "Ryan Mitchell has been misappropriating company funds for personal use over approximately the last 18 months, Karen said carefully. Expenses categorized as client entertainment, business development, and executive relocation costs were, upon closer examination, personal expenditures entirely unrelated to company business. Designer clothing, luxury vacations, jewelry purchases exceeding $40,000 on a single occasion, all routed through company accounts and disguised within legitimate-sounding expense categories. Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach, remembering the broken heater, the $312 in their checking account, the months she went without buying herself anything new, while Ryan claimed the household budget was tight. "How much total?" Emily asked quietly. "Just under $2.1 million, Karen said. The room went silent for a long moment as Emily absorbed the number, feeling something between vindication and nausea churn through her chest simultaneously. "There's more," Jonathan said gently, watching her carefully. "This is where it becomes relevant, not just to the company's financial health, but potentially to legal exposure. Several of these misappropriated funds were used specifically during the final year of your marriage, Emily, the same year Ryan repeatedly told you the household finances were under severe strain." Emily's hands began to shake. "He was telling me we couldn't afford to fix the heater," she said slowly, the words coming out barely above a whisper, "while spending $40,000 on jewelry." "It appears that way," Jonathan said quietly. "For who?" Emily asked, though some sick, intuitive part of her already suspected the answer. "Who was the jewelry for?" Karen pulled another document from her folder, sliding it across the table. A receipt dated 14 months earlier from an upscale jewelry boutique in downtown Seattle. The recipient's name listed clearly in the delivery instructions: Victoria Lane. Emily stared at the receipt for a long time, feeling something inside her that had been quietly, carefully holding itself together for months finally begin to crack open completely. "He was buying her jewelry," Emily said, "while telling me we couldn't afford groceries some weeks, while I was working 3 jobs, while I gave up my own dreams to keep our household together." "Emily," Jonathan said gently, "I understand how painful this is, but I need you to understand what this means practically, because it changes the entire landscape of what's happening right now. This isn't simply misappropriation of company funds anymore. This constitutes financial fraud with potential criminal exposure, and depending on how the divorce proceedings unfold, it also has significant implications for any claims Ryan might attempt to make against marital assets." Emily wiped her eyes, forcing herself to focus, forcing the shaking in her hands to still. "What do we do with this?" "That depends entirely on what you want," Jonathan said. "We can turn this over to Mitchell Global Development's board immediately, which would almost certainly result in Ryan's termination and likely trigger a criminal investigation. We can use it as leverage during divorce settlement negotiations, which are about to become considerably more contentious given his public claims against you. Or we can simply document it for our records and decide our next steps once we see how he proceeds." Emily sat with the question for a long moment, staring at the receipt, at Victoria's name printed in careful script, thinking about every month she had scraped and sacrificed while this had been happening behind her back. "I want to see the settlement negotiations play out first," Emily said finally. "I want to give him one more chance to be honest, to stop this narrative he's building in public before we escalate anything further." "That's a generous approach," Jonathan said, "given everything you now know." "It's not generosity," Emily said quietly. "It's making sure that when this finally comes out, and it will come out, there's no question about who acted honestly and who didn't." The formal divorce settlement negotiations began the following week. Conducted through attorneys on both sides in a sterile conference room downtown, Ryan seated across the table from Emily for the first time since the confrontation in his own office building weeks earlier. He looked different now, Emily noticed immediately. Thinner somehow. The polished confidence that had defined him during their marriage's final months, replaced by something more brittle, more desperate. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting sleepless nights that had nothing to do with success. His attorney opened with a settlement demand so audacious that Emily nearly laughed out loud, despite the tension in the room. Given the significant appreciation of marital circumstances during the period of separation, Ryan's attorney began, his tone carefully professional despite the outrageous nature of what followed. "Our client is seeking a settlement of $15 million, reflecting what he considers fair compensation for the emotional and professional damages sustained during this process, as well as recognition of the partnership that contributed to the eventual inheritance circumstances." Emily's own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Deborah, glanced at Emily with an expression that clearly communicated she found this demand as absurd as Emily did. The inheritance in question, Deborah said calmly, was received by my client individually, from her own grandfather, entirely separate from any marital partnership, after your client had already filed for divorce. There is no legal basis connecting Mr. Mitchell to this inheritance. My client experienced significant reputational and professional harm, Ryan's attorney continued, undeterred, including the loss of a major business deal due directly to actions taken by Ms. Carter using her newfound position of ownership. We believe this constitutes a form of retaliatory harm that merits compensation. Emily felt her composure finally begin to slip, the accumulated weight of weeks of lies and public humiliation reaching its limit. "May I speak?" she said quietly, looking at Deborah, who nodded slightly, giving her permission. Emily looked directly at Ryan for the first time since sitting down, and something in her expression made him visibly flinch. "You want compensation for reputational harm," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath it. "Ryan, I have documentation, dated, verified, undeniable, showing that you misappropriated over $2 million in company funds during the final 18 months of our marriage, including approximately $40,000 spent on jewelry for the woman you were having an affair with, purchased during months when you told me repeatedly that our household finances were too strained to fix a broken heater." The room went completely silent. Ryan's attorney turned sharply toward his client, his expression shifting from professional composure to alarm. "That's outrageous," Ryan said, though his voice cracked slightly, betraying the panic beneath his denial. "That's a fabrication. You're making this up to intimidate me." "I'm not making anything up," Emily said calmly, nodding toward Jonathan, who slid a thick folder across the table toward Ryan's attorney. "Every transaction is documented. Every receipt, every falsified expense report, every dollar traced directly back to your personal accounts and gifts to Victoria Lane. My forensic accounting team has been extraordinarily thorough." Ryan's attorney opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page, his expression darkening with each passing second as he flipped through the documentation. "Ryan," he said quietly, turning to his client, "we need to take a recess." "No," Ryan said, his voice rising now, the desperation finally breaking through completely. "This is fabricated. This is exactly the kind of retaliation I've been talking about publicly. She's manufacturing evidence because she's angry, because she wants to destroy me." "Ryan," Emily said, her voice cutting through his protests with quiet, devastating clarity, "I have receipts with your signature on them. I have delivery confirmations to Victoria's apartment. I have internal company emails discussing concerns raised by your own colleagues about irregular expense patterns months before I ever knew any of this existed. This isn't fabrication. This is exactly what happened, and you know it." Ryan's face had gone pale, his earlier fury collapsing into something closer to panic as he realized the full weight of what was sitting on the table in front of him. "If this becomes public," Emily continued, her voice quiet but unwavering, "and it certainly will if you continue demanding $15 million in this settlement, or if you continue giving interviews painting yourself as the victim, Mitchell Global Development's board will have no choice but to launch a formal investigation. Given the scale of what my team uncovered, that investigation will almost certainly result in criminal charges. Embezzlement of this magnitude typically does." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Ryan's attorney quietly closing the folder, his expression grim. "I think," Ryan's attorney said carefully, "we need to significantly reconsider our position." Ryan sat frozen, staring at the table, his hands clenched into fists, the reality of his situation finally completely settling over him. "Why?" he finally said, his voice barely audible, looking up at Emily with something that looked almost like genuine confusion beneath the panic. "Why didn't you just turn this over immediately? Why negotiate at all if you had this the entire time?" Emily considered the question for a long moment before answering, choosing her words carefully. "Because despite everything," she said quietly, "despite the cruelty, despite the lies, despite the affair and the public humiliation you tried to put me through, some part of me still hoped you would find your own way to honesty before I had to force it out of you. I wanted to believe there was still something in you worth giving a chance to." "And now?" Ryan asked. "Now I know there isn't," Emily said simply, "not because of the money you stole, though that's damning enough on its own, but because even sitting here, right now, faced with undeniable evidence, your first instinct was still to accuse me of lying rather than take responsibility for what you actually did." Ryan had no response to that. He simply sat there, deflated, the last remnants of his earlier composure completely gone. The negotiations that followed moved swiftly after that moment, Ryan's demands collapsing entirely under the weight of what Emily's team had uncovered. Within the hour, his attorney had withdrawn the $15 million demand entirely. And by the end of the session, Ryan had agreed to a settlement that involved no claim whatsoever against Emily's inheritance. A formal, notarized statement retracting the public claims he had made during his interview, and a private acknowledgement, documented for legal purposes, of the misappropriated funds, with a structured repayment plan negotiated to avoid immediate criminal referral, contingent entirely on his full cooperation and complete honesty moving forward. As the meeting concluded and papers were signed, Ryan sat alone at the table for a long moment after everyone else had begun gathering their things, staring at the settlement documents in front of him. His career, his reputation, and his carefully constructed public narrative all in ruins simultaneously. "Emily," he said quietly, as she prepared to leave the room. She paused at the door, looking back at him. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice hollow now, stripped of all its earlier confidence, "I think I understood, somewhere underneath everything, that I was going to lose you the moment I stopped seeing what you actually gave me. I just didn't understand it until right now, sitting here, watching everything I built collapse because of choices I made instead of choices you forced on me." Emily studied him for a long moment, feeling something complicated settle over her. Not quite forgiveness, not quite closure, but something adjacent to both. "I hope you figure out who you actually are, Ryan," she said quietly. "Underneath all of this, I genuinely do. But that's not my responsibility to help you find anymore." She walked out of the conference room without waiting for a response, Jonathan falling into step beside her, and as the elevator doors closed behind them, sealing away the room where 8 years of marriage had finally, completely ended, Emily felt something inside her chest release entirely, a tension she hadn't fully realized she was still carrying. "You could have destroyed him completely in there," Jonathan said quietly, watching her carefully as the elevator descended. "The board referral, the criminal charges, all of it was within your power to pursue immediately. Instead, you gave him a path to accountability without total ruin. May I ask why?" Emily considered the question for a long moment, watching the floor numbers tick downward. "Because destroying him wouldn't have given me anything back," she said finally. "It wouldn't have given me back the 8 years, or the dreams I set aside, or the version of myself I lost somewhere along the way trying to make him happy. The only thing that actually gives any of that back to me is choosing, deliberately, not to let his choices define what kind of person I become in response." Jonathan smiled slightly, something like quiet respect in his expression. "Your grandfather would have been proud to hear you say that." Emily felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, thinking of a man she barely remembered who had somehow, from a distance, understood exactly who she was capable of becoming long before she understood it herself. "I hope so," she whispered, as the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, and Emily Carter walked out into the afternoon light, no longer the woman who had once knelt on a cold kitchen floor believing herself worthless, but someone entirely new, someone who had faced the very worst of what betrayal could offer and chosen, deliberately to become something better because of it, rather than in spite of it. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks after that conference room settlement, quietly, without fanfare, through a stack of documents that Emily signed at Jonathan's office on an unremarkable Tuesday morning that somehow felt both monumental and strangely ordinary at the same time. She remembered staring at her own signature on the final page for a long moment, the ink still wet, thinking about how strange it was that 8 years of marriage could end with something as simple as a pen moving across paper, the same paper that had once terrified her when Ryan first set it on their coffee table. "How do you feel?" Jonathan asked gently, watching her from across the desk as she set the pen down. Emily considered the question honestly before answering. "Lighter," she said finally. "I expected to feel sad. I think I did feel sad for a long time. But right now, in this moment, I mostly just feel free." "That's a good place to arrive," Jonathan said, offering her one of his rare, genuine smiles. She thought the story might quietly end there, the way most difficult chapters eventually do, fading slowly into background noise as life moves forward. But 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Patricia called with news that made Emily sit down hard at her kitchen table, phone pressed tightly against her ear. "I wanted you to hear this from me before it reaches you some other way," Patricia said carefully. "Victoria Lane left Ryan. Apparently it happened rather suddenly and rather publicly at a restaurant downtown. Several people who witnessed it have already been talking." Emily felt something complicated rise in her chest, not quite satisfaction, not quite surprise, something closer to the quiet, inevitable feeling of watching a pattern complete itself exactly as predicted. "What happened?" Emily asked. "From what I understand," Patricia said, once word spread through his professional circle about the embezzlement settlement, about the criminal exposure he only avoided through repayment and cooperation, about the board placing him on administrative leave pending a full internal review. Despite the private settlement terms, Victoria apparently decided his prospects had dimmed considerably. She was seen with a different executive from a competing firm less than 2 weeks later. Emily sat in silence for a long moment, thinking about Jonathan's words from months earlier, about patterns and documented histories, about a woman who attached herself to rising success and vanished the instant that success wavered. "He built an entire life around impressing people like her," Emily said quietly, mostly to herself, and the moment he had nothing left to offer, she disappeared exactly the way she disappeared from the last person. "It seems that way," Patricia said. Emily hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of her apartment for a long time afterward, waiting to feel triumphant, waiting for some sharp, satisfying sense of justice finally served. But instead, what settled over her was something quieter, sadder almost, a recognition that Ryan had spent years chasing an image of success so hollow that even the woman he betrayed his marriage for had only ever wanted him for exactly the same reasons he had once claimed to want Emily gone. He built his entire second life on the same foundation of conditional value he had used to discard her, and that foundation, Emily realized, had simply collapsed beneath him the exact same way. She thought briefly about reaching out, some old, worn instinct rising unbidden, some remnant of the woman who used to comfort him after every professional disappointment. But she caught herself before the thought went any further, remembering exactly where that instinct had gotten her for 8 long years, remembering the wrench in her hand and the divorce papers on the table, and the words that had shattered something inside her chest that took months to rebuild. She didn't call him. She let the silence stand. 2 months later, the board's internal investigation at Mitchell Global Development concluded, and despite the private settlement Ryan had negotiated with Emily, the findings were severe enough that the board voted unanimously to terminate his employment, citing breach of fiduciary duty and violation of company financial policy. Because he had cooperated fully during the investigation, as required by his settlement agreement with Emily, criminal charges were ultimately declined. But his career within the industry, an industry built heavily on reputation and trust, effectively ended that same week. Emily learned about the termination through a brief industry newsletter Jonathan forwarded her, along with a short note. "Thought you should know. No further action required from us. This chapter appears to be closing on its own." Emily read the note twice, then closed her laptop, feeling something settle inside her that she hadn't expected to feel. Not joy, exactly. Something closer to peace, the quiet, unremarkable peace of watching consequences unfold naturally, without her having to force or engineer a single moment of it. She thought about calling Grace to share the news, then decided against it, realizing she genuinely didn't want to spend any more energy discussing Ryan Mitchell. She had spent enough of her life orbiting around his choices, his failures, his cruelty, his eventual downfall. It was time, she decided, sitting alone in her apartment that evening, to spend her energy on something that actually belonged to her. She called Priya the next morning. "I want to move forward with the downtown renovation," Emily said, her voice carrying an excitement she hadn't felt in years. "Not just as a design project. I want to turn it into something bigger." "Tell me what you're thinking," Priya said. Emily had been thinking about it for weeks, turning the idea over quietly in the private hours between board meetings and estate reviews, letting it grow slowly into something she finally felt ready to say out loud. "When I was 22, Emily said, I had a partial scholarship to a design program. I gave it up because Ryan needed support building his career, and there wasn't room in our budget for both of us to chase something uncertain. I've spent years wondering what would have happened if I hadn't given it up. I don't regret the choice anymore, not really, because it led me here eventually. But I keep thinking about how many other people are exactly where I was back then, talented, determined, and one financial obstacle away from losing their entire future." "You want to fund scholarships," Priya said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. "I want to build something permanent," Emily said. "Not just scholarships, though that's part of it. I want a foundation. Full tuition support for architecture students who can't otherwise afford it. Mentorship programs connecting them with working professionals, and eventually, once it's established, I want to use some of my grandfather's land holdings to develop actual affordable housing projects designed by the very students the foundation supports." Priya was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "Emily, that's an enormous undertaking." "I know," Emily said, "but I have the resources now to make it real, and I have absolutely no interest in spending the rest of my life simply managing an inheritance. I want to build something with it, something that actually matters." "Then let's build it," Priya said, and Emily could hear the smile in her voice. Over the following months, Emily threw herself into establishing the foundation with a focus and determination that surprised even Jonathan, who had watched her navigate months of grief, betrayal, and legal complexity with remarkable composure, but who now watched something entirely different emerge, a woman driven not by survival or vindication, but by genuine, joyful purpose. She named it, after considerable deliberation, the Emily Carter Foundation for Young Architects, though she nearly chose a different name entirely, something less personal, something that didn't put her own identity so visibly at the center of the work. Jonathan gently convinced her otherwise during one of their final formal meetings regarding the estate structure. "Your grandfather built his entire fortune anonymously," Jonathan said. "He avoided headlines, avoided rankings, avoided any public acknowledgement of what he accomplished. And in some ways, I think that anonymity cost him something important. Very few people ever knew the good his resources could have done while he was alive to see it unfold. I don't think you need to make the same choice, Emily. There's nothing wrong with letting your name be attached to something you're proud of." Emily thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, as the foundation slowly took shape, as the first cohort of scholarship recipients was selected from a pool of hundreds of applicants, young people from backgrounds remarkably similar to her own, working multiple jobs, supporting families, chasing design dreams that felt perpetually out of reach. She met each of the first 10 recipients personally, something her advisory board gently suggested she might not have time for given the scale of her other responsibilities. But Emily insisted, sitting down individually with each student over coffee, listening to their stories, recognizing pieces of her younger self scattered across each conversation. One particular meeting stayed with her long after it ended. A young woman named Sophia, barely 23, who had been accepted into a prestigious design program but had turned down the acceptance twice already, unable to afford the tuition gap even with partial aid, working 2 jobs to support her mother after her father's unexpected passing. "I almost didn't apply for your scholarship," Sophia admitted, sitting across from Emily in a small downtown cafe. "I figured foundations like this always go to people who already have some kind of connection, some kind of head start. I didn't think someone like me actually had a real chance." Emily felt something tighten in her chest, recognizing the exact fear she herself had carried for years, the quiet, corrosive belief that opportunity belonged to other people, people with better circumstances, better luck, better starting points. "I want you to hear something," Emily said carefully. 10 months ago, I was sleeping in a coffee shop booth with everything I owned in 2 suitcases, because my husband decided, after 8 years of marriage, that I had nothing left to offer him. I didn't inherit this foundation's resources because I was born into privilege, Sophia. I inherited them because my grandfather specifically wanted someone who understood exactly what you're feeling right now, someone who knew what it meant to sacrifice for other people without ever expecting anything back. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry that happened to you. Don't be sorry, Emily said gently, because if none of that had happened, I wouldn't be sitting across from you right now, and you might have turned down that acceptance a third time. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us ends up clearing a path toward something we never could have reached otherwise. Sophia enrolled in the design program the following semester, fully funded, and sent Emily a photo, 8 months later, of her first completed architectural model, a small, elegant community center design, along with a message that Emily kept saved on her phone long afterward. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself yet. Emily read that message during a particularly difficult week, one where old grief resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by nothing more than a stray memory of Ryan's voice, the sound of divorce papers hitting a coffee table, the cold shock of a marriage ending in a single conversation. She had learned, over the months since that terrible night, that healing rarely moved in a straight line, that grief could resurface unexpectedly even after significant progress, even after genuine happiness had begun rebuilding itself in its place. She called her therapist that week, someone Jonathan had connected her with early in the process, and spent an hour working through the resurfaced pain, understanding slowly that the goal was never to erase what happened entirely, but to build a life substantial enough that the pain no longer defined its shape. You're allowed to still feel sad sometimes, her therapist told her gently during that session. Healing doesn't mean the hurt disappears completely. It means you build enough around it that it stops being the only thing you can see. Emily thought about that often in the months that followed, watching the foundation grow, watching the downtown renovation project transform from blueprints into an actual physical space, a mixed-use building, combining affordable housing units with a ground-floor community design center where local students could access studio space, mentorship, and resources they otherwise couldn't afford. The building opened almost exactly 1 year after the night Emily had knelt on that cold kitchen floor with a wrench in her hand, and Jonathan insisted on hosting a small opening ceremony, despite Emily's initial reluctance to draw public attention to herself. Let people see what you built, Jonathan said. Not for your ego, Emily. For the people who need to know something like this exists. The ceremony was modest by the standards of Emily's current wealth, held in the building's ground floor community space filled with scholarship recipients, local architecture students, a handful of city officials, and Grace, who had flown in specifically for the occasion, standing beside Emily with tears in her eyes as she looked around the space. Do you remember, Grace said quietly, leaning close to Emily during a lull in the small gathering, when we were kids, and you used to draw those little house sketches in the margins of your school notebooks, Mom used to worry you'd never focus on anything practical. Emily laughed softly, an easy, unguarded laugh that felt entirely different from anything she remembered from her marriage. I remember. I don't think she ever imagined this, Grace said, gesturing around the room, at the students clustered together examining design boards, at the warm, purposeful energy filling a building that represented not just Emily's inheritance, but everything she had chosen to build from the wreckage of her old life. I don't think I imagined this either, Emily admitted. Jonathan approached them a moment later, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider, offering one to Emily. Your grandfather would have loved this, he said quietly, watching the room with genuine warmth. I only knew him in his later years, mostly through business dealings, but I remember something he told me once during one of our final meetings before his health began declining seriously. He said the entire purpose of what he built wasn't the buildings themselves, or the land, or even the money. He said all of it was simply infrastructure for whoever eventually understood what to actually do with it. Did he know that would be me? Emily asked. All those years ago when he was researching potential heirs, could he have possibly known I would end up here doing this? Jonathan considered the question carefully. I don't think he knew the specifics. I don't think anyone could have predicted the exact path that led you here. but I think he understood something essential about your character, something that made him confident that whatever you eventually built with this inheritance would come from a place of genuine values rather than simple accumulation. I think, in that sense, he knew exactly what he was doing when he chose you. Emily looked around the room one final time, at Sophia deep in conversation with another scholarship recipient, at the warm lighting spilling across freshly painted walls, at a space that had once been an empty, neglected building, and was now something alive, something purposeful, something that would outlast every single person currently standing inside it. She thought about Ryan briefly, the way she sometimes still did, though the thought carried none of the sharp, aching pain it once held. She had heard, through occasional secondhand updates she no longer actively sought out, that he had taken a lower-level position at a much smaller firm in a different city, starting essentially from the bottom of an industry that had once celebrated his rapid rise. She felt no satisfaction in that information anymore, no lingering need for further justice or vindication. She simply felt, when she thought of him now, a quiet, distant sense of closure, the recognition that his story had continued on its own trajectory, entirely separate from hers, no longer capable of touching the life she had built in his absence. Nearly a year and a half after that terrible night in their old kitchen, Emily received an unexpected letter, not through Jonathan's office, not through any legal channel, but delivered directly to the Foundation's front desk, addressed simply to Emily Carter in handwriting she immediately recognized. She almost didn't open it. She held the envelope for a long moment, sitting alone in her office at the end of a long day, feeling old, complicated emotions stir faintly beneath the surface of a life she had worked so hard to rebuild. Eventually, curiosity outweighed hesitation, and she opened it. The letter was short, handwritten, clearly composed with considerable effort. Emily, I don't expect you to respond to this, and I understand if you'd rather never hear from me again. I only wanted you to know that I've spent the last year trying to understand exactly how I became the person who said those things to you that night. I've had a lot of time to think, working my way back up from essentially nothing. And most of that thinking has centered on you, on everything you gave me that I never once acknowledged while I had it. I read about your foundation. I saw the building you opened downtown. I want you to know that I'm genuinely proud of what you've built, even though I have no right to feel proud of anything connected to you anymore. You deserved someone who saw your worth the entire time, not someone who only recognized it once it became impossible to ignore. I'm not asking for anything. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not sure I've earned the right to even ask for it. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I lost, and it wasn't the inheritance. It was you. I hope you're happy, Emily. I mean that more sincerely than I've meant almost anything in my life. Ryan. Emily sat with the letter for a long time after reading it, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions move through her, none of them quite what she expected. She didn't feel angry reading it. She didn't feel the old ache return either. She felt mostly a quiet, settled sense of distance, the recognition that this letter, whatever sincerity it contained, belonged to a chapter of her life that had already closed completely, one she had no need or desire to reopen. She thought about responding briefly, then decided against it, not out of lingering bitterness, but because she genuinely had nothing left to say to him. Her life had moved so far beyond the version of herself that once needed his validation, that responding felt almost like writing to a stranger about a story that no longer belonged to her. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not to keep as a wound, but simply as a closed chapter, a marker of how far she had traveled since the night those words first devastated her. She never mentioned the letter to anyone, not even Jonathan, not even Grace. It simply became a quiet, private piece of closure, something she carried forward not as pain, but as proof of exactly how much distance she had put between the woman who once believed she was worthless and the woman she had become since. The foundation continued growing over the following years, expanding well beyond its original scope, funding dozens of scholarships annually, developing 3 additional affordable housing projects across properties Emily's grandfather had once quietly accumulated for reasons no one, perhaps not even Alexander himself, could have fully anticipated at the time. Emily eventually returned to school herself, part-time, alongside her foundation work, finally completing the architecture degree she had abandoned a decade earlier, walking across a graduation stage at 35 years old to accept a diploma that represented not just an academic achievement, but the reclamation of a dream she had once believed was permanently lost. Grace attended that graduation, along with Jonathan, along with Priya, along with several of the young architects Emily's foundation had supported over the years, an entire community of people Emily had built around herself, deliberately, thoughtfully, in the years since walking away from a marriage that had tried to convince her she was worth nothing at all. Standing at a small celebration afterward, glass of champagne in hand, surrounded by people who genuinely knew and valued her, Emily thought back one final time to that cold winter night, to the wrench in her hand, to the words that had shattered something inside her chest, to the terrifying uncertainty of walking out into the Seattle night with everything she owned crammed into 2 old suitcases. She thought about how impossible it would have seemed, standing in that ruined kitchen, to imagine the life she now stood inside of. A life built not on someone else's approval, not on shrinking herself to fit someone else's ambitions, but on the full, undiminished truth of exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of building when finally given the room to try. Jonathan approached her near the end of the evening, offering a quiet, knowing smile. "Your grandfather used to say something else," he told her, "something I never shared with you before now because I wasn't certain you were ready to hear it. He said the people who underestimate you are only revealing what they were never capable of seeing in the first place. But he also said something after that, something I think applies to you more than anyone I've ever watched inherit anything from him." "What did he say?" Emily asked. "He said the ones who survive being underestimated, the ones who actually rebuild something meaningful from it rather than letting it destroy them, those are the ones who were never meant to simply inherit an empire. They were meant to become one." Emily felt tears gather in her eyes, not from grief this time, but from something closer to gratitude, the overwhelming recognition of exactly how far she had traveled from the woman who once believed a single man's cruel words defined her entire worth. Ryan Mitchell had once told her she had nothing left to give, that she was never meant to rise alongside him, that her sacrifices had been nothing more than a stepping stone toward a future that never included her. He had been wrong about almost everything that night, but he had accidentally been right about one thing, though not in the way he intended. She was never meant to rise alongside him. She was meant to rise entirely on her own, into something greater, something more purposeful, something built not from someone else's approval, but from the quiet, unshakable knowledge of exactly who she had always been, waiting patiently beneath the surface, for the moment she finally had the courage and the resources to let that woman fully emerge. And in the end, that was the truest inheritance her grandfather ever left her, more valuable than any building, any acre of land, any number printed on any estate document. He left her the undeniable proof that the people who discard us for not being enough are almost always the ones who were never capable of recognizing what enough actually looked like in the first place, and that the only person whose belief in our worth truly matters is our own. Emily Carter walked away from a marriage that called her worthless, and she built, from that very ruin, an empire that would outlast every single person who ever doubted her. That is how her story ends, not in bitterness, not in revenge, but in the unshakable, permanent truth that some people are never broken by what they lose. They are simply, finally, revealed by it. 3 years passed after that graduation ceremony, and in that time, Emily Carter's life had settled into something she once believed impossible. A quiet, steady rhythm built entirely on her own terms. Though the story, as it turned out, still had one more chapter waiting to unfold. One Emily never could have predicted sitting in that coffee shop booth with 2 suitcases beside her. It began, unexpectedly, with a building. The foundation had grown far beyond its original scope by then, funding dozens of scholarships each year, overseeing 4 completed affordable housing developments, and preparing to break ground on its most ambitious project yet, a mixed-use community center in a struggling neighborhood on the eastern edge of Seattle. an area Emily had specifically chosen because her grandfather had once quietly purchased several parcels of land there decades earlier, land that had sat undeveloped and largely forgotten until Emily decided it was time to finally give it purpose. The architectural firm handling the design consultation sent over their lead project architect for the initial planning meeting, and Emily walked into the conference room that morning expecting nothing more than another professional exchange of blueprints and budget projections. She did not expect to feel her breath catch slightly when a tall man in his late 30s stood to greet her, dark hair slightly disheveled, in a way that suggested he'd been running late, kind eyes behind simple wire glasses, a rolled set of blueprints tucked under one arm. "Ms. Carter," he said, extending his hand. "Daniel Reyes, I'll be leading the design team on this project." "Emily, please," she said, shaking his hand, noting the firm, unpretentious grip, so different from the practiced, calculated handshakes she'd grown accustomed to in boardrooms full of investors and executives. "I have to say," Daniel admitted, settling into the chair across from her as they began spreading blueprints across the table. "When I found out I'd be working directly with the foundation's founder, I expected someone a bit more, intimidating." Emily laughed, an easy, genuine sound. "I get that a lot. I actually applied for one of your scholarships years ago," Daniel said, glancing up at her with a slightly sheepish expression. "Before the foundation existed, obviously. Back when I was finishing my graduate program and drowning in tuition debt. I ended up taking out loans instead, but I've followed the foundation's work ever since it launched. What you've built here, it's not just admirable, it's rare. Most people with this kind of wealth don't actually put in the work themselves. You're in every meeting. You know every project detail. That says something." Emily felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest at the observation. Not because she needed validation from anyone anymore. She had spent years building that security internally. But because there was something genuinely refreshing about a person who seemed to see her work clearly, without any of the calculations she had learned, painfully, to recognize in people drawn toward her resources rather than her character. "It matters to me," Emily said simply, "more than almost anything else in my life right now." Over the following months, as the community center project moved from initial concept through detailed planning, Emily found herself looking forward to her meetings with Daniel in a way that eventually became impossible to ignore. Their conversations extended naturally beyond blueprints and budgets, into long discussions about design philosophy, about the neighborhoods they were trying to serve, about Daniel's own complicated history, growing up in a family that had struggled financially for most of his childhood, an experience that gave him a genuine, grounded understanding of exactly what Emily's foundation was trying to accomplish. "My mother cleaned houses for 20 years. Daniel told her one evening, the two of them still in the office long after everyone else had gone home, reviewing structural revisions over cold coffee. "She used to tell me that the buildings she cleaned, the beautiful ones, the ones with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, those buildings weren't actually better than our apartment. They just had better publicity. I think about that a lot when I design. I try to make sure the buildings I create for people without much money feel just as intentional, just as dignified, as the ones built for people who have everything." Emily studied him for a long moment, something settling quietly into place inside her chest. "That's exactly why I wanted you leading this project," she said. "I read through a dozen portfolios before choosing your firm. Yours was the only one that talked about dignity instead of just efficiency." Daniel smiled at that, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes in a way Emily had learned, through painful experience, to recognize as rare and valuable. "Can I ask you something personal?" Daniel said, hesitating slightly. "You don't have to answer if it's too much." "Go ahead." "There are rumors," he said carefully, "about how you came into all of this, about a difficult marriage, an inheritance, some kind of very public unraveling of your ex-husband's career. I've never wanted to bring it up because it's genuinely none of my business, but I've always wondered how someone comes back from something like that and builds something this generous instead of something bitter." Emily was quiet for a long moment, considering how much of herself she wanted to share, aware that this conversation felt different from the countless times she had deflected similar questions from journalists, from casual acquaintances, from people whose curiosity felt more invasive than genuine. But something about Daniel's question felt different. It didn't feel like curiosity about her wealth or her story's dramatic elements. It felt like genuine care. "He told me I had nothing left to offer him," Emily said quietly. "After 8 years of marriage, after I gave up my own dreams to support his career, he handed me divorce papers and told me I was never meant to rise alongside him. I found out about my inheritance the same night, sitting in a coffee shop with everything I owned in 2 suitcases." Daniel set down his coffee cup slowly, his expression shifting into something serious and attentive. "That's an extraordinary thing to survive." "I didn't just survive it," Emily said. "For a long time I thought that would be enough. Just surviving it, just getting through each day without completely falling apart. But eventually I realized survival wasn't actually the goal. I wanted to build something that proved him wrong, not through revenge, but through simply becoming exactly the person he claimed I never could be." "I'd say you succeeded," Daniel said quietly. "Some days I believe that," Emily admitted. "Other days, honestly, old doubts still creep back in. I don't think that ever completely disappears." "I don't think it's supposed to," Daniel said gently. "I think it just becomes smaller, over time, less capable of controlling you, even if it never fully disappears." Emily looked at him for a long moment, feeling something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. A cautious, tentative openness toward the possibility of trusting someone new. "Can I ask you something now?" she said. "Of course." "Why haven't you ever asked me out?" Emily said, surprising herself with the directness of the question, "given how many evenings we've spent exactly like this one." Daniel laughed softly, running a hand through his hair, something almost nervous crossing his expression for the first time since they'd met. "Honestly, because you're my client, and because everything I've read and heard about your history made me terrified of being just another person trying to get close to you for the wrong reasons. I didn't want to risk making you feel like that, even accidentally." "That's the most reassuring thing anyone said to me in years," Emily said quietly. "Does that mean," Daniel asked carefully, "that if I did ask you to dinner, sometime after this project wraps up, purely to remove any question of professional conflict, you might actually say yes?" Emily felt a genuine smile spread across her face, the first time in a long while she had felt this specific, uncomplicated flutter of possibility. "I might say yes right now, actually, project or no project." Daniel's answering smile was immediate and unguarded. "Then how about Friday?" Their relationship developed slowly over the following months, carefully, deliberately, both of them aware of exactly how much was at stake, how easily trust could be exploited given Emily's resources, how important it was for Emily to move at a pace that allowed her genuine certainty rather than the rushed, desperate hope that had once led her into a marriage where she consistently gave more than she received. Daniel never once asked her for anything. He split every dinner bill evenly during their early dates despite Emily's protests, insisting quietly that he needed the relationship to develop on equal footing rather than becoming something shaped by her wealth. He continued running his own architecture firm independently, even as their relationship deepened, deliberately maintaining professional distance from any project directly connected to her foundation once their personal relationship became serious, hiring an associate to handle those accounts instead. "I don't ever want you to wonder," he told her one evening, nearly a year into their relationship, sitting together on the balcony of the apartment she had finally purchased for herself. A space entirely her own, filled with furniture she had chosen because she loved it, rather than because it needed anyone else's approval. "Whether I'm here because of what you have or because of who you are, I want that question to never even need asking." Emily felt tears gather in her eyes, thinking of every year she had spent wondering, quietly, painfully, whether Ryan's love for her had ever been genuine or simply convenient until something better appeared. "You never have to worry about me wondering that," Emily said. "You've never once given me a reason to." It was nearly 2 years after that first meeting in the conference room when Daniel proposed, not through some elaborate public gesture designed for attention, but quietly, during a weekend trip to a small cabin near the same lake where Emily and Ryan had once spent their modest 3-day honeymoon so many years earlier, a location Emily had chosen deliberately, wanting to reclaim the memory of that place for something entirely new. They were sitting by the water at dusk when Daniel took her hand, his own hands trembling slightly, with a nervousness that made Emily's heart swell with tenderness. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to do this," Daniel said, "and every version I planned felt too small for everything I actually feel. so I'm just going to say it plainly. Emily, you are the most genuinely good person I have ever known, and somehow, despite everything you've survived, you've managed to build a life defined by generosity instead of bitterness. I don't want to build my life next to that anymore. I want to build it with you." He opened a small box, a simple, elegant ring inside. Nothing extravagant, exactly the kind of understated beauty Emily had grown to love about him. "Marry me," he said simply. Emily didn't hesitate, didn't feel the old fear that once might have made her cautious about trusting a man's promises so completely again. She simply felt certain, in a way she had never once felt certain during her entire marriage to Ryan, and that certainty carried its own quiet, powerful answer. "Yes," she said, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, absolutely yes." Their wedding, held 8 months later, was intentionally modest despite Emily's resources. A small gathering in the community center's newly finished courtyard, the very building Daniel had designed, filled with scholarship recipients who had become like family over the years, with Grace serving as maid of honor, with Jonathan walking Emily down a short aisle since her own father had passed years earlier, his eyes bright with emotion as he squeezed her hand gently before releasing her toward Daniel waiting at the end. "Your grandfather would have loved this man," Jonathan whispered to her just before the ceremony began. "He would have recognized exactly what kind of person deserves to stand beside you." Emily smiled through her own tears. "I think he already knew, somehow, all those years ago, when he decided to leave everything to someone who understood what actually mattered." The ceremony itself was simple, heartfelt, filled with vows that spoke of partnership rather than possession, of mutual respect rather than sacrifice, demanded from only one side. Emily stood there, surrounded by a community she had built deliberately from the wreckage of a life that once tried to convince her she was worthless, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a completeness that had nothing to do with the billions of dollars attached to her name and everything to do with the people who had chosen to stand beside her simply because they valued who she was. But the story's final quiet act of closure arrived nearly a year after the wedding, unexpected and strange in the way life's most meaningful moments often are. Emily was attending an industry conference downtown, invited as a keynote speaker to discuss the foundation's affordable housing initiatives, standing backstage reviewing her notes when a conference organizer approached her with an unusual request. "Miss Carter, I apologize for the interruption," the woman said carefully, "but there's a gentleman asking if he might have a brief word before your talk. He says he used to know you, Ryan Mitchell." Emily felt her stomach tighten slightly, an old, familiar tension resurfacing despite the years of healing behind her. She hadn't seen Ryan in person since the settlement negotiations years earlier, hadn't spoken to him since that letter she'd quietly filed away in a drawer. Closure she had never needed to reopen. "Send him back," Emily said finally, curiosity and a settled sense of her own strength outweighing any lingering discomfort. Ryan looked different when he appeared a few minutes later, older somehow, though only a handful of years had passed, his once polished confidence replaced by something more grounded, more genuine, dressed in a simple, unremarkable suit that suggested a career considerably more modest than the one he'd once pursued so aggressively. "Emily," he said, his voice careful, uncertain, "thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to ask for even a few minutes of your time." "You have 5 minutes," Emily said, not unkindly, but firmly, protecting the boundary she had worked years to establish. "I just wanted to see you," Ryan said quietly. "In person. I saw your name on the conference program, and I couldn't stop myself from coming, even though I knew this might be inappropriate." "Why?" Emily asked simply. Ryan was quiet for a moment, seeming to search for the right words. "I work for a small firm now in Portland. Nothing like what I used to have. I do good work, honestly, work I'm actually proud of. Small residential projects mostly. It took me a long time to rebuild something, and even longer to understand that what I rebuilt matters more, in its own quiet way, than anything I chased before." "I'm glad you found something meaningful," Emily said, and she meant it, surprising herself with how easily the sentiment came, free of any lingering bitterness. "I got married again, too," Ryan said. "Almost 2 years ago. Her name is Claire. She's a teacher. We don't have much money, not compared to what I used to have, but Emily, I understand now, finally, completely, everything I couldn't understand back when I had everything I thought I wanted. Claire reminds me of you, actually, not in appearance, but in the way she gives without keeping score, the way you always did, the way I never once appreciated until it was far too late. Emily felt something settle quietly inside her chest. Not quite forgiveness exactly, something closer to genuine peace. The recognition that the man standing in front of her now was fundamentally different from the man who had once discarded her so casually. "I'm happy for you, Ryan," Emily said, and this time, the sentiment carried no hidden edge, no lingering resentment beneath the surface. Genuinely. "I don't deserve that grace," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion, "but thank you for giving it anyway." "I'm not giving it to you," Emily said gently. "I stopped carrying anger toward you a long time ago, Ryan. What I feel right now isn't really about you at all. It's just relief, honestly, that both of us eventually found our way towards something real." Ryan nodded slowly, seeming to understand the distinction completely. "I should let you prepare for your talk," he said, glancing toward the stage. "I just needed you to know, after everything, that I finally understand what I threw away, and more importantly, I finally understand why you deserved so much better than what I gave you." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her one final time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "watching what you've built, the foundation, everything, I think your grandfather saw exactly what he was doing when he chose you. I don't think anyone else could have turned what happened into something this good." Emily watched him walk away, feeling the last, quiet remnant of an old wound finally close completely. Not through revenge, not through forcing an apology, but simply through time, through growth, through the natural, inevitable way that genuine change eventually reveals itself in people capable of real transformation. She delivered her keynote 20 minutes later, standing before an audience of industry professionals, telling them about affordable housing, about dignity in design, about the foundation her grandfather's quiet, deliberate legacy had made possible. But near the end of her talk, she found herself adding something she hadn't originally planned to share. "Several years ago," she said, her voice steady and clear across the auditorium, "I lost everything I thought defined my worth in a single conversation. A person I loved told me I had nothing left to offer, that I was simply a stepping stone toward a life that never included me. I want you to understand something, because I think it matters far beyond real estate or architecture or anything we're discussing today. The people who tell you that you have nothing left to give are almost always revealing something about their own limitations, not about your actual worth. I didn't rebuild my life by proving that man wrong. I rebuilt it by discovering slowly, patiently, exactly who I was, underneath everything he convinced me to believe about myself." The room fell into a respectful, attentive silence, and Emily felt something powerful settle over her, the recognition that her story, painful as its origins had become something capable of genuinely helping other people navigate their own moments of devastation. After the talk concluded, dozens of attendees approached her, sharing their own quiet stories of setbacks, of being underestimated, of rebuilding after circumstances that once felt insurmountable. Emily listened to each one carefully, offering what encouragement she could, understanding now fully why her grandfather had chosen her specifically for this legacy. It wasn't simply about managing wealth responsibly, it was about understanding from lived experience exactly what it felt like to be discarded, underestimated, told your sacrifices meant nothing, and choosing, despite all of that, to become something extraordinary anyway. That evening, driving home from the conference, Daniel waiting for her with dinner already prepared, their small dog greeting her enthusiastically at the door, Emily felt an overwhelming, quiet gratitude settle over her entire life, thinking back across the years to that terrible winter night when everything had seemed irreparably broken. She thought about the wrench in her hand, the divorce papers on the coffee table, the cold walk to that 24-hour coffee shop with 2 suitcases dragging behind her through the Seattle night. She thought about the phone call that changed everything. About Jonathan's patient, careful guidance through those first disorienting weeks, about the conference room where Ryan's face had drained of color completely, about the settlement negotiations, about Sophia's grateful tears, about Priya's steady partnership, about Grace standing beside her at both the foundation's opening and her wedding, about Daniel's quiet, unwavering certainty that had finally taught her what genuine partnership actually felt like. She thought about her grandfather, a man she barely remembered from childhood, who had somehow understood her more completely than the husband she spent 8 years beside, who had left her not just a fortune, but a chance to discover exactly who she had always been capable of becoming. Emily Carter had once believed that her worth depended entirely on what she could sacrifice for someone else, on how much of herself she could give away before there was nothing left. She had learned through devastating loss and unexpected inheritance, through public humiliation and quiet vindication, through heartbreak and genuine hard-won love, that her worth had never actually been in question at all. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for the moment she finally chose to see it clearly herself. And in the end, that recognition, more than any building, any acre of land, any number attached to any estate document, became the truest, most permanent inheritance of her entire life. She was never broken by what she lost that winter night in Seattle. She was, finally and completely, revealed by it. And everything she built afterward stood as permanent, undeniable proof that some people are not destroyed by being underestimated. They are simply given, at last, the exact conditions they needed to finally become who they were always meant to be.